Hello and welcome to this review of the war in Ukraine for 2023. Today I am joined by Mr. Raging Mandrill and Mr. Furious Pertinax. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Greetings, everyone. Hello, Charlie. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming on. And, as viewers will be familiar, we've covered the war a couple times on the channel. Today, we're just doing a sort of full year wrap up review of everything that's happened in 2023, or at least the big events. Talk about the current state of the conflict. We have a few specialty topics picked out, and we're also going to do a full frontline review. So let's just jump right into it, since this will probably be a fairly lengthy discussion. So first things we'll cover is basically what are the big lessons of the war thus far. Um, so to start out with, one of the things you've heard a lot is comparisons to World War One. I think those comparisons are actually largely misplaced. Um, they're I understand why people have made parallels to that conflict, mostly in terms of the front lines being extremely static, and the war sort of primarily being an artillery war. But it does differ from the First World War in a number of ways. I mean, for one, you don't actually have these huge, miles long lines of trenches like you do in World War One. You do have trench warfare, but not to the same extent that you have in the First World War. For example, I'll actually bring up on the screen right now for people to look at what I'm talking about. Just find the correct tab here. There we go. So if we look at Google Maps updates about once a year, and I was zoomed in on Klashivka there, which is just south of Bakhmut, and you could actually see some of the trench networks now. So there are earthworks in Ukraine. There are trenches, pretty typical traditional type zigzag trenches like you see in the World War, actually. But these are field fortifications, put up in specific locations. And here we're actually on a hill overlooking Klashivka, and what we don't see is a giant trench line, basically running across the entire country, which is what you'd really see if this was truly a World War One battle. And also, what's not happening is, you don't have miles of trenches just packed with the guys, um, because then all that would happen is they'd be sighted in by artillery and wiped out basically immediately. And those artillery barrages aren't the sort of thousand shell concentrated hour-long barrages of World War One, but precisely targeted attacks, often sighted in by drones, which will get us into the sort of next big lesson of the war. So I'll hand it over to you, gents. We'll go to Furious first on this point, but I think in terms of comparing this war to World War One, the main way it really that analogy really holds is just in terms of the mostly static nature of the front line, and sort of the general idea of the primary way that sides are engaging with each other is through the use of artillery. But other than that, I don't think the war is particularly comparable to the First World War. Marcus.
Yeah, certainly. I'm inclined to agree. Like you say, there's that sort of slight comparison that does fit, and that is the use of trenches. Although that in itself is, you've already elucidated as to why, you need to go into a little bit of context as to why it isn't the same as World War One. Yeah, and just to reiterate what you said, we don't see these, massive artillery saturations. We don't even see bombardments that are anywhere near the duration of what we saw in the First World War. Indeed, a lot of the use of artillery has been almost reminiscent of like the Hoytier tactics, or the the so-called Stormtrooper tactics, the stormtroop tactics of World War One, with sort of like short, sharp barrages. That's generally what we see more of, rather than, I mean, if we're to believe the reports, than these, like you say, these World War One style saturation artillery sort of usages. And likewise, we don't see human wave attacks. I mean, I know the media's made much of like the Russians apparently throwing themselves headlong into attacks, but aside from a few, one might say, questionable photographs from Bakhmut, there's nothing really to suggest that. Indeed, given Putin's political situation at home, although he is actually obviously popular amongst the Russian people. I mean, he can't afford for just like, truckloads of body bags to be sort of being unloaded in Moscow. It would, his position, given that, how can I put this? Obviously, NATO, as we've seen before with other people, such as Gaddafi and Saddam or whatever. Once you're sort of on the shit list, so to speak, you really have to be like Assad has. You have to walk a really tight line to sort of stay in power. And I mean, I know obviously Russia is large and Russia is powerful in its own right, but I mean, as we've discussed in previous streams, Russia has worked hard to insulate itself from these circumstances, and it has. Which is obviously why the sanctions did not work when they were thrown on Russia at the beginning of this conflict. But Putin, is not like this all powerful dictator. I hate to use the word, but he's not an autocrat in like the style of a a Mussolini or a Franco. And he still is at whims of certain power structures and certain certain inertias that exist within amongst Russian elites. And I mean, he can't afford for just like the Russian army to just run into machine gun fire and die on the battlefield. So again, what we've probably seen, if we just sort of look at how things have played out over time, the Russians have been actually quite methodical, meticulous, and the withdrawal over the Kherson bridgehead, for instance, is an example of the Russians playing a low risk strategy. Them digging down and staying on the defensive rather than actually going on to the attack when Ukraine was a recipient of the massive shipments of military equipment that they received, in the first half of this year, which we obviously analyzed on previous streams, was an indication of this careful strategy. So, this whole this trope, shall I say, of human wave attacks and sort of World War style sort of analogies. You're right, is ill fitting, Charlie.
Okay, Mandrill.
Well, I think if we're going to recap the war, this is kind of the year of NATO shills coping and seething.
Speaking of which, IGO.
Yeah. So the NATO plan going into the 2023 year was the expectation that Russia's economy was going to collapse because of international sanctions. And that the Ukrainian offensive, using an incredible amount of Western aid, which is essentially bootstrapped and cobbled together. We went over all of the specifics and the details of all of that in a previous stream, and the equipment that was given. But the offensive basically did not go as planned. And so they slogged for 6 months, 4 months, whatever it was, and no substantial gain, not even taking the preliminary prerequisite objective towns such as Tokmak. And really, so this is where NATO is, after 2 years of conflict, the enthusiasm for this has kind of died down, I think, on both sides. And now you're getting into a more grinding phase of, okay, who has the will and the resources to continue going? That's pretty much my long-term strategic take on the conflict.
Yes, and in terms of scheduling, we kind of put this together last minute since I've been on vacation and it's pretty hard to schedule around the Australian. But I did see Gio in chat, and I did tell him I'd invite him on to talk about Ukraine if he wanted. So I will put the link. I'll DM you the link, and if you want to join, you are welcome to. So I will look out for you if you want to come in. But anyway, continuing. Yes, so. One of the big things about the war is the use of drones, right? That's sort of the big game changer we've seen, is the mass use of these FPV or first person view drones on both sides. And one of the things you should understand about how these drones are employed is it is not like every single infantryman has like a personal little drone that he can deploy, like it's a grenade or something. The way I've seen the Russians do it, at least, and I'm sure the Ukrainians basically do the same thing, is they actually have specialized drone units that seem to work in pairs. And these guys are trained in the use of the drones, similar to what you see on the screen. And, they will go into the woods launch the drone from just outside the tree line, and then run back in, and then do a reconnaissance mission or whatever type of mission they're on. And then the drone will fly back and they will leave their position before artillery gets sighted in on them. So that's the way the drone warfare is primarily working. Is it's specialized teams of operators, and it's not like they're, again, it's not like World War One where you have your guys in a trench with drones and they're like sending drones to the other trench to bomb them or something. That's not what's happening. The other big thing with drones is less that, the sort of flashy sights you see where the drone will drop a grenade in a tank and the tank will blow up or something like that. The big game changer with these drones is that basically every side can see everything the other side is doing at all times. And this is a game changer because what this means is that it's almost impossible to build up a large force that is capable of launching a concentrated offensive of like armor without being sighted and then attacked by artillery and having all your tanks and your infantry fighting vehicles destroyed before they even get to go anywhere. So that's been a real game changer, and I think that's primarily what's the most interesting use of the drones is not actually in how they attack individual targets, but the reconnaissance capabilities of the drones. And that's really why we haven't seen the type of large scale, let's see, where's my tab? The large scale, here it is. We haven't seen these large scale big arrow offensives anymore, like we saw in the first year of the war with the assault on Kiev, and in the second year of the war. No, that was the same year. Still in 2022, we saw the sort of big counteroffensive from the Ukrainian side near Luhansk, and we don't see the Russians doing these big maneuvers anymore. And that's really because the drones enable you to just see the other side building up to attack. Mandrill, you first on this one. Anything to say about the use of drones?
Yeah, on your point of the usage of drones, it's almost like it becomes very difficult to use surprise as one of the 9 principles of war. For those who watched Hitman's stream on the subject with me, basically, if you can have refined targeting information at all times of enemy assets, what type of assets, where they're going, how many, etc., it becomes very difficult for fog of war to exist. So really, it's not even just at the tactical level, it's also at the operational level too, and even the strategic level too, because it means that like you said, the large scale offensives just aren't going to be able to be utilized. Like I like to always say, Frederick the Great in today's day and age, with the amount of cheap sensory equipment that can detect basically everything, whether that's electro-optical cameras on drones, whether that's infrared, whether that's electronic warfare, etc. It's almost impossible for a figure such as Frederick the Great to arise today, because he just wouldn't be able to defeat an army twice his size, because you can't use surprise and also therefore maneuver. So your maneuvers are much smaller. They're much more limited. And I think that's my take.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I think I think Mandrill covered it well. Just to reiterate that what we've really seen is almost 2 usages, though, is that it's kind of like a cheaper, more localized version of, say, like UAV technology, which obviously came into the fore like when the Americans, or the coalition, the willing, went into Afghanistan and Iraq, and you sort of have these large sort of aircraft style UAVs that take to the skies and present satellite sort of high quality images back to command. Whereas what the drone has done is sort of allowed that to be decentralized down at the, forget even like the regimental or battalion level, but almost at the squad level, and it's all in real time. So there's that aspect of it. And then the second aspect is obviously like the sort of the 2, like the cheap version or like the lesser version, which is where sort of like loitering munitions, they can like drop, basically what are glorified grenades on soft targets such as infantry. And we've seen, sadly, a lot of those videos on Twitter or X or whatever, and I really don't like to see them. Like they're actually quite, watching men scurry for their lives is quite a disheartening thing to watch at the best of times, no matter what side it is. And then obviously there's these more sophisticated drones like is it the Shahed, the Iranian drone that's like basically like a homing, or not a homing, but it's like a self-detonating, like homing drone as well, self-detonating drone. So there's sort of a couple of different varieties of drones, which we actually see. And of course, because it's an embryonic technology, we're kind of just seeing what its applications are, how they might sort of transpire in the fullness of time. And the Ukrainians and the Russians have both kind of shown us or demonstrated what these capabilities, what they are, even in their infancy. I dare say drones will have a correspondingly greater impact on war as time goes on. But this is truly the first, never mind is this the first proper conventional conflict in Europe since the Second World War, but it is also the first conflict in our era that has actually had drones, certainly at scale. So when you put those two things sort of together, makes for an interesting sort of march of technology in that sense.
Yes,
I think
go
the thumbnail that Charlie had for the beginning of the stream was an excellent art form in describing what modern war is basically like, and especially with drones. That picture is so poignant because you have like an ancient rusted mortar shell of unknown origin, bootstrapped to a modern commercial drone, basically dropping on top of people in trenches. And that's basically what it is now. And like we've said many times before, getting old weapons and giving them new life and giving them new capability is a way that you can make resources stretch further. Yeah, that one. Charlie, I don't know if you know you're muted.
Uh-oh. Charlie. Have we lost him?
Yeah, sorry
there he
about
is.
that. So I had the thumbnail brought up there, and yeah, I agree with you. It's a great thumbnail for the overall war. But what I have up here now is I think looking back on the Kiev offensive from 2022 is interesting in light of everything everyone's learned so far about how a peer-to-peer conflict is actually going to go. So if we look at this attack on Kiev that failed, and we imagine the Russians trying like something like this today, they would get absolutely wiped out. Everyone remembers all of the pictures of the tank traffic jams on these highways, and this gets sort of into Jimmy Thomas territory, where west of Kiev you have the famous marshlands, and then coming in from the east, you can see there's only a few highway arteries that lead mostly in the correct directions, but they really concentrate your forces. The Russians didn't actually conquer all this territory. They basically just drove hundreds of tanks on the roads straight to Kiev, which caused these massive traffic jams. And of course, tanks use a lot of fuel. And then when your tanks are just, not actually moving, but they're still running, trying to move because they're encountering resistance, you're going to use up all of your fuel reserves. And then that's going to cause further traffic jams, bringing the trucks in. And obviously, the war hadn't really fully gotten going then. But if Ukraine had the drone operation capabilities in being at the time of this, the Russians would have gotten entirely wiped out. So we can see here basically is this first phase of the war, the Russians were using these sort of Cold War tactics that were sort of that you would apply like in the Fulda Gap or something. They were applying that to how they were going to take Ukraine, which is just sort of go for a direct assault on Kiev, and hopefully the city capitulates. But you can see they were actually stopped just on the outskirts of Kiev, because it turns out if you encounter resistance, your tanks can't simply drive into the city.
So this is where you get into the distinction between Cold War tactics and modern tactics. And I'm not actually certain that this style of Fulda Gap armored advance is necessarily ineffective in modern drone warfare. You can do it, But you have to be willing to accept losses when you do any sort of large attack at scale. And what we saw for this in terms of force composition in like this was a misstep or a misjudgment in Russian planning is that they didn't have enough infantry to secure the ground behind them. And of course, if you have drones, as you said, recon capabilities, it doesn't really matter. All these little areas that are unconquered, essentially, you could have them filled with Ukrainian infantry or recon elements, and as long as they have drones, they can provide targeting information to other Ukrainian forces. So long as they have a radio, which of course most military formations do these days, if not all of them. So really, and this is where you start getting into discussion about a more broader discussion about tactics and strategy. This style armored advance and for anybody who's played Advanced Wars, right? When you send your tanks forward in Advanced Wars, and this is not exactly a 1-for-1, but if you send them up unsupported with their flanks basically unguarded, with no infantry on the flanks, no unit that's protecting them, they're going to get outflanked and destroyed in detail, which is mostly what happened. So I'm not saying that armored assaults aren't obsolete or anything, or they don't have vulnerabilities, but the Russians did not sufficiently plan that armored assault in the sufficient manner that it needs to be.
Sorry, can I just add on to Mandrill slightly, Charlie?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that analysis is pretty spot on. But I'll just add to it by saying that that there were losses amongst the infantry that was able to keep up, or indeed if there's any sort of like infantry that was sort of mechanized that went along with those tanks in sort of armored personnel carriers. What was occurring is wherever the Ukrainians did have even sort of armed border guards or smatterings of rear echelon troops, they were actually, from what I can ascertain from the sources and from what has been reported, it appears they were actually inflicting like trickle losses on Russian forces in those headlong sort of spearhead attacks. But the other flip side is about this, whether this attack is obsolete or not. In the end, of course, the drone warfare capabilities were not nearly as refined then as they are now. But it is worth mentioning that if there was an advantage from the attacker's standpoint of actually doing it, is that the Ukrainians had no idea where to defend. If you look at those, if you can zoom this map out, Charlie, just sort of so we can sort of see at least like the eastern half of Ukraine. So you can see here that they'd crossed the Dnieper at where Kherson City is and essentially conquered the entirety of the Kherson Oblast, which they've obviously since abandoned the left bank of it. But I mean, they advanced east west of Kiev, on the western side of the Dnieper, out of Belarus. They went through Chernigov and Sumy in the north, and that's where a lot of those unconsolidated sort of highway attacks occurred. And obviously, they made pretty strong headway in the Kharkov Oblast. They essentially surrounded Kharkov to some extent, and they pushed as far as Izium and Liman, and those are places that they gave up earlier at either the end of last year or the start of this year, I think it was. But essentially, by attacking in all these various vectors, the Ukrainians were unable to actually mass in a concentrated fashion. The Russians did kind of put off foot the Ukrainian defense, at least to a point. Obviously, Donbass has been central to this conflict for a plethora of reasons. But the fact that the Russians actually went in headlong to a point actually was an advantage, in like an operational strategic sense.
Yeah, we can also kind of see the Russian endgame as envisioned based on their initial conquest as well, which looks like they viewed taking Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkov are pretty much the endgame, plus all the territory they've had already, which basically means everything east of the Dnieper plus Odessa appears to be how they thought they would be able to end the war if they took those things within the first few weeks or months, which obviously didn't play out. But I think this gives us an idea of what their actual aims are. So also back on to the subject of the sort of tank assault tactics. We can also see that the Ukrainians more or less learned similar lessons, and we'll get more into the counteroffensive. But here we have sort of the main push of those, Leopard 2 tanks and the other modern NATO equipment that was sent to Ukraine. And initially, in this salient that they developed around Robotyne, they actually used similar tactics where they attempted to do a mass armored assault south towards Tokmak, but that actually didn't work too well for them because they started taking heavy losses in the minefields and in the prepared defenses that the Russians had. It worked a little bit, but clearly they didn't mass the armor they needed. If they had, say 10 times the equipment as Mandrill had referenced, maybe they would have actually been able to break through. So it's not that the tactic is necessarily obsolete. It's just that you actually have to have the numbers to take the losses and be willing to. And the Ukrainians had neither. And what was interesting is the Ukrainians in this counteroffensive actually switched tactics. Zaluzhny actually uh, abandoned the NATO tactics and started the strategy of what you'd call tree line hopping, whereas you can kind of make out on the map here, Ukraine is divided into these tons and tons of just fields, mostly farmland, especially in the south, and there are lines of trees between them. And what the war really transitioned to is infantry supported by armor hopping between tree lines, and the goal of the war basically is to just take subsequent tree lines until you actually get to a city, and then you attempt to take the tree lines around the city until you encircled it, and then finally you can actually assault the city itself. Here we're just looking at a small town, Verbova, but that's a really interesting development, is this transition from sort of this mass armored warfare to more like an infantry based tree line hopping strategy.
Well, that's pretty much in keeping with the Allied strategy, especially the American tactics in Normandy in World War II. I know we hate to do World War II comparisons because I'm Furious is about to go off here, but the this is the correct way, right? Which is you send your infantry forward first, and then you use your tanks in support. Tanks, in my view, and any sort of maneuver element has to be viewed in the same fashion as 19th century cavalry, right? And in conventional warfare, cavalry are at their best when there has already been a breakthrough and they are now in the exploitation phase or the pursuit phase. That's when armor forces and cavalry really begin to shine. So in order to break through, the actual Ukrainian tactic of pushing through and making the initial breakthrough with infantry was probably correct all along. I don't think that's the Soviet approach was necessarily incorrect, that's a holdover from the Soviets. The reason why I say this is because this whole armored offensive from the American and NATO perspective was done with the way that the fashion that the Americans would have done it. However, that approach is going to be heavily reliant on air power and air superiority that the Ukrainians obviously did not have, which is why you're now seeing belatedly F-16s being rushed to Ukraine in terms of military aid.
Now that we've sort of gone through the broad lessons of the war, let's transition to talking about the developments in 2023 specifically. So I think for Ukraine, I think the biggest development actually is, let's see if we could find the tab. I think the biggest accomplishment for Ukraine in 2023 was not the counteroffensive or anything like that, but actually the damage they've done to Russia's Black Sea fleet, which is significant because it doesn't have a direct bearing on the conflict as it stands. But what it does do is, especially given the number of amphibious ships they've struck, what it does do is make it much more difficult for Russia to perform their own landing across the Dnieper again, and assault Mykolaiv and then Odessa, because ultimately, although these strikes don't necessarily affect the war as it's going, it affects the potential future that the future offensives that Russia could launch across the Dnieper. So this is sort of your area of expertise, Mandrill. So what do you think of what's been happening in the Black Sea?
Right. So this is one of the reasons where military aid becomes extremely prominent. And as people who might be familiar with naval strategy, a fleet in being is oftentimes more powerful when it's sitting and bottled up in harbor than it is in the open. When it's in the open, it can be destroyed. If it's sitting in port, then it can be used as a threat. So this is where aid to Ukraine is so crucial, because Ukraine has been receiving quite a bit in terms of really anything in naval aid. There's been a lot of specifically the Harpoon weapon system that's been transferred from various countries like Denmark, Norway, etc., the United States, also Britain. Which basically gives the Ukrainians the ability to have shore-based launcher batteries and to keep, the Russian Navy away from Odessa. So that's number one. Number two is there's been quite a bit of unmanned surface craft, which has been utilized to some pretty decent effect against the Russian surface forces in the actual Black Sea. And this is where you start seeing vessels like this little ocean-going tug down at the bottom corner there. That was one that was attacked, if I remember correctly. Some of these amphibious ships, however, were not damaged by that, but they were actually, if I'm not mistaken, damaged when they were actually in port in Sevastopol, which is interesting to me because I think Ukraine understands the strategic position of Russia and understands that the Russians want to eventually launch an attack on Odessa. And the easiest way for the Russians to do that would be to launch a simultaneous attack both from the land side of Odessa as well as from the sea and take it that way. That'd be the easiest and best way to do that, and I think the Ukrainians understand that, which is why they seemed to target these landing ships that you see in the center of the screen. Now, for other ships, the Moskva is the most famous one that's been destroyed by the Ukrainians, and that was destroyed by an Ukrainian-built anti-ship cruise missile, which is comparable to Harpoon. The United States did give them the targeting data for that. They bragged about it in one of the DoD affiliated outlets. But so this is just where you like seeing all these ships damaged from missile strikes, and I mean, if I knew more about what exactly or how deep the damage was for these ships, because I don't know what they mean by severely disabled. Does that mean your engineering plant is down, or is your I'd have to see what their definition is for disabled, but obviously grayed out is sunk, which is interesting. So notable is obviously the Kilo class submarine that you've got at the bottom here. The Kilo class is an excellent diesel submarine. It's a Cold War sub. But the most notable thing about it, is, especially from the Russian perspective in terms of precision-guided missiles, is that the Kilo class submarine can launch precision-guided, land attack missiles. Like it can launch Caliber missiles, etc. These other ships can launch, land attack missiles and things like that, which is probably why the Ukrainians are striking them as heavily as they are.
Right, and yeah, it's difficult to say how actually out of commission any of these things are. Obviously, the grayed out ones are sunk, and if you'll notice, only a few of these ships have actually been sunk. The red marks basically indicate that they are quote unquote destroyed, whatever that means. Presumably, the Russians will be
severely disabled. Severely disabled, which means who knows what that means. That could mean anything from losing a weapon system, losing a radar, losing your propulsion capability, something like that. Is fairly severe damage, most likely something of that nature. But of course, this is going to not be the same for every single ship. So, unless we actually knew the casualty report specifically of what was broken on these in particular vessels, I mean, it becomes very difficult to say, okay. It's also interesting because it's very difficult to actually sink a naval warship if it's, if it basically has all of its hatches dogged down and it's in a material condition, it's been maintained. It's very difficult to sink these things. It does take quite a bit of ordnance to actually make them go to the bottom.
Right, and that's why the destruction of the Moskva was such a prestige kill, basically, because they actually sunk the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. This is significant just in terms of Ukraine demonstrating capabilities.
And it's a huge black eye on the Russians too. And I'm sure that this is.
I think that's more significant than the loss of the vessel itself in terms of like the Russian Black Sea Fleet's capability to take Odessa. I think the prestige loss of the Moskva is more significant than its actual capabilities.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The Moskva, like so many of these other vessels that you see on the screen here, like these are all ex-Soviet assets, really. The Moskva was built in the late 70s. A lot of these other landing ships, the Alligator class landing ship, etc. These are all ex-Soviet vessels, basically. And they don't have a lot of air defense capability. They don't really have any surface capability, attack capability, or much of them anyway. I was surprised by how lightly armed they were compared to the American naval amphibious ships, even in terms of defensive capabilities or air defense. So that was something that I, when I was doing my homework for this last night, that I noticed. But the real thing about the Soviet Navy or the Russian Navy is most of it is ex-Soviet. Like 80 to 90% of it is probably of Soviet vintage. And really, I know that the Moskva was a vessel that the Russians are trying to replace. They need a new cruiser. Once you get towards the end of a vessel service life, which is around 50 years, you need to start thinking about replacing it, just because the maintenance costs get too high and you can't get spare parts anymore. So in the grand scheme of things, the Moskva, it's almost like, and especially with the Russian fleet, I'm not saying this isn't significant, because it takes a long time to rebuild naval assets. But all of these ships, which are of ex-Soviet vintage, are going to have to, like with everything else in this war that's of Cold War era vintage, those things are going to have to get replaced in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years anyway. So, like I've said before, with this Cold War era kit, it's not as much of a loss as people perceive of it.
Yeah, it is worth pointing out that none of this is top of the line modern technology. I mean, just looking at this fleet, this is the kind of stuff that the Americans would have already retired. But of course, the Russians are a much poorer country and are still using what they have. We can also add that while this damage is significant, it's not game changing yet. But let's say the Ukrainians are able to inflict similar damage on the Black Sea Fleet in 2024. Let's say sink 2 more amphibious warfare ships and heavily damage another 2. That could start to seriously limit Russia's capabilities to actually do any sort of amphibious operation if they're able to keep this up. Right now, I don't think the Black Sea Fleet has been taken out of the game in terms of its threat to Odessa. So the pro-Ukraine side likes to play this up, and understandably, because like I said, I think this is the biggest achievement of the Ukrainians of the year, because this is actually a significant blow to the Russians.
This also demonstrates too, Mandrill might be able to chime in on this to some degree, but ever since the arrival of air assets in war, and I mean the real first modern application of that is World War II. And I know Mandrill had the joke about, we spoke about World War II, the cat's out of the hat, but just for the sake of this discussion, is that the reason we saw sort of the death of the capital ship, the battleship, and even like the battle cruiser throughout the course of World War II was that you have this ship that is many thousands of tons of high quality steel and full of all kinds of complex machinery and componentry and gun turrets and loading mechanisms and all the panoply that goes on warfare. And a lot of these ships, particularly the ones built leading up to the war and that were put to sea during the war, they have very large complements of anti-aircraft guns, and they were aware of the risks posed to them. But we see this, for example, when I think it was Prince of Wales and Repulse was sunk, just taking out to sea out of Singapore. And the Japanese, air assets, their naval assets from the carriers, put both ships under sea within an hour. You could even say with far less sophisticated planes that the British put off their carriers. The naval strike on Taranto, where the Italian ships were probably some of the weakest in terms of their anti-air assets, were very much embarrassed by the British attack on Taranto in 41. And you have these big lumbering ships that have hundreds, if not thousands, of crew, and all those crew take a lot of hours to train and make competent, and they have to manage these systems, and it's all very expensive and resource intensive. And yet a plane with a torpedo or even a squad, even a wing of torpedoes or a wing of dive bombers can just decommission this thing, and in some cases actually detonate them and blow them up. Now, things have obviously moved on since World War II. Things have changed an awful lot, and you just don't have these massive, large ships with these huge crews anymore. It's not like you're going to have an incident like the Hood where you sort of lose 90% of hands on decks, and it's like literally thousands of men have died. But it's still a case of that these ships we're talking about, and the Moskva being sort of how did someone put it here in the chat? Like, it was essentially like it was the flagship. It was sort of a ceremonial flagship. Yeah, Tolpakor. I think that's quite right, an accurate description. The Moskva, I mean, it still had effective use to a point, but it was definitely a ship that had hit some kind of obsolescence. And in the end, the Russians are not natural at sea in the same way, say, as the British or the Americans or the Japanese are. It's very much a second tier concern for them after the arm in the Air Force, where the Russians have historically much more competence and a much greater emphasis placed on it. But nonetheless, the point I'm making is that, for what is a second tier concern for the Russians, naval assets are still energy intensive, they're still resource intensive, they're still labor and manpower intensive, they're man hour intensive. And what we've just seen essentially is a transition from planes with torpedoes and dive bombs to drones being used, and essentially like missiles to the point, anti-ship missiles. And we've sort of heard a lot of theory about it because we haven't seen conventional powers actually use these technologies head to head. But what this war has done is actually brought this to life. What is the result of these anti-ship missiles and anti-ship munitions, and what's the impact on them? And I mean, yes, there's probably, if you look at these yellow and red crosses, there's about a 50% strike rate between ships being totaled and ships being recoverable. But still, for what is essentially a relatively cheap weapon system or relatively cheap munition, it's placing these expensive pieces of military equipment out of order, and is posing active risks to them. So I just think that's an interesting thing to take into account.
Yeah, what you're describing there, Furious, is actually called mission kill.
Yeah. Thanks.
If you can take out the necessary function of a piece of military equipment, like say a air defense radar on one of these ships, or if you're taking out its engineering plant, or if you're destroying its capability to launch surface to air missiles, and or that whatever its main job is, if you can knock that out, that's a mission kill basically. And so when I see this, I think basically, okay, severely disabled is probably what they're classifying as mission kill. And yeah, the thing about mission kill is it's not like it's impossible to do, but what you just described is basically the negation of gigantism in terms of any sort of military, especially naval asset. And you can see why Russia has been building a lot of these little corvettes, especially in the Black Sea. This is one of Russia's big claims to fame in naval terms. They like to build these little corvettes because they can put anti-ship cruise missiles on them, and they become extremely cheap and rather irritating. And they're like a third or less of the cost of like an actual like Arleigh Burke DDG. So yeah, and this is perfect for a littoral zone and in a relatively small sea like the Black Sea, not like open ocean.
Yeah, your point about gigantism also applies to tanks as well, because what we've seen is gigantism in armor, where you send you have a small number of high tech tanks like M1 Abrams, which I don't think we've actually seen yet in combat, or at least destroyed, or the Leopard tanks. You could have a few dozen of these, but what you really need is not your most well armored, most high tech tanks, but 10 times more of basically anything. What you need is a massive scale, and not gigantism. So the T-72 or even T-55s, if you have hundreds or thousands of those that you are willing to lose in a mass armored assault, that's actually how you would achieve a breakthrough. Which kind of gets us to the next accomplishment of Ukraine. So trying to be as fair as possible. In 2022, they did launch their counteroffensive, and they did manage to take some territory back. I think, unfortunately, the West still believed in gigantism and believed that a small number of their best, most well-armored, most modern tanks would be able to achieve a big breakthrough, and they just didn't. What you need is just to overwhelm the enemy defenses and drone reconnaissance with sheer numbers and be willing to lose those things. So what did the Ukrainians actually accomplish in terms of their counteroffensive? Well, you can see it in the green here. They did actually manage to take a significant amount of territory. They, of course, have the famous salient around Robotyne, which is fairly minor. Probably their bigger gains actually were around Velka and Novoselica, where they actually took many, let's see, we could actually measure this. It's probably close to like 100 square kilometers of territory, actually. What's the distance there? I can't actually see because my screen share thing is hiding it. But yeah, the Ukrainians managed to take this in addition to their counteroffensive around Robotyne. They actually managed to take a lot of territory around Bakhmut, some of which has been taken back, but they still pushed the Russians out of this territory.
That southern arm of the pincer that developed during the Battle of Bakhmut was basically retaken, you could say.
So yes, the Ukrainians managed to take back everything you see in green here this year. I would say that's number 2 in terms of their actual accomplishments, and then third and far more minor, but we should still point it out. They've managed to form a beachhead over here in Krinky across the Dnieper River and haven't been entirely pushed out. Although I think that in large part the Russians are simply choosing not to push them out, but indeed the Ukrainians have at least managed to develop and hold a beachhead across the Dnieper here in Krinky. Trying to be as fair as possible here. I know, I guess the point is the Ukrainians haven't actually performed well in 2023. They've really managed to do very little other than the Black Sea fleet destruction. They've made minor changes in the front line and have not inflicted any major strategic blows against the Russians like they did at the end of 2022, as you see here with all of this territory taken back in Luhansk, and of course the retreat from Kherson. They have not managed to do a repeat of that, and I think that's in large part to what we referenced about drone warfare. And we can move on to the Russian accomplishments unless anyone wants to say anything else about what Ukraine has actually managed to achieve this year.
I might just add to what you're saying is that these big evacuations we saw from the first Russian withdrawal in 2022 was a case of them evacuating territory in a sort of staged sense. Obviously, there's that the contentious discussion about them evacuating those pincers either side of Kiev and then from places in and around Chernigov and Sumy in the north. And then, of course, with the onset of the actual that first counteroffensive that was launched by the Ukrainian forces, and here's actually you're quite it's good that you're hovering over Kharkiv here, because this is probably where the biggest Russian setback was, and what you might call the biggest Ukrainian success as well. But again, it has to be sort of taken into consideration. But a lot of this was the Russians making a decision to trade lives and space for time, or rather, sort of, that they're willing to sort of make the trade-off of not digging in and sort of suffering losses in a headlong advance, which the Russians kind of missed. It must be said, the Ukrainians did catch them on the hop, and so aside from a few encounter battles, I think there was some defensive actions around sort of not Izium per se, but I think around sort of Yampil, Zarichne, like on the other side of Liman. I believe it was the Don Cossacks were sort of active around there. But essentially, an evacuation took place. And what we sort of saw to a lesser point is that I think around Robotne, and there's a salient down the south, which I think became quite the talking point this year, that the Russians actually held with quite a lot of determination. But again, where the Ukrainians were actually sort of massed, often the Russians would just would pull back to more secure lines and to sort of let the artillery do the heavy lifting. What we've actually seen is, although the media sort of talk about this whole, Russian human wave attacks, actually it's almost kind of contradictory. The Russians are almost sort of utilizing elastic defense here to a point, and they've been more inclined to fight Ukraine on their terms, and whereas it's been unfavorable, the Russians have just simply sort of relinquished after sort of an initial firefight. So it's interesting to see even the Russian tactics not being what we would assume them to be, certainly from a historical standpoint of where the Russians, shall we say, have a reputation for certain military behaviors. But this war has actually proven something rather different.
Yeah, and I suppose we could also credit the Ukrainians with not only having routed the Russian forces across the Oskol River in 2022, but they've actually managed to hold on to those gains in 2023, despite the Russians attempting, with a supposedly 100,000 man strong force in Luhansk to take that territory back. And we can see that they're trying to take Kupiansk and redevelop their line to the Oskol River, which is the obvious defensive point, and also required of them in order to control the Luhansk Oblast. But yeah, we could also credit the Ukrainians with holding the territory they managed to gain. And indeed, this is the real big defeat of the Russian forces in 2022. It's not the retreat from Kiev or Kherson. It's this, because this is the place where the Russian forces were genuinely in a retreat and even a rout in some cases. But of course, that was last year. This year, the Ukrainians did not manage to repeat anything like that. And neither did the Russians. We can say the front line has changed very little the entire year. But that being said, the bigger Russian accomplishment of the year, of course, is the taking of Bakhmut, which seems like forever ago at this point, but indeed it was in 2023 that the Russians developed the front line, roughly from, accidentally started zooming out there. The Russians developed the front line like roughly around, come on, measurement tool, there we go. Roughly around like here. And they managed to, of course, as everyone knows, envelop and then ultimately take Bakhmut. They were pushed back a bit, but obviously that's their major accomplishment. Everyone's talked about Bakhmut plenty. I don't think we need to analyze that battle in here. Just pointing it out. Secondarily, I would say their second big accomplishment is actually the double envelopment of Avdiivka, and we'll get more into that battle as we talk about the entire frontline review, but they're sort of setting up to repeat the Bakhmut situation on a smaller scale in Avdiivka for 2024. And then, of course, the third big accomplishment, and maybe you could rank this as number one, is they actually managed to stop the Ukrainian counteroffensive completely. Yes, the Ukrainians achieved some success, but they did very little of significance around Bakhmut other than take Klashivka back. They took significant territory around Velika Novoselika, but they didn't actually manage to get to the famous Surovikin line. In here, in Rabatny, they actually did manage to penetrate the outer edge of the Surovikin line, but didn't really get anywhere. So the Russians held off everything the Ukrainians and NATO could throw at them in 2023 to a pretty significant degree. And I guess it's worth commenting on, too, just how utterly bizarre this whole counteroffensive was, where I've never seen anything like this, where they actually had movie trailers for the counteroffensive. We didn't see anything like that for this big offensive in Luhansk, of course, that threw the Russians back. But I guess it might be worth commenting on how bizarre this whole year's counteroffensive has been, where you have movie trailers and it's announced well in advance. And although it's kind of obvious where the Ukrainians should attack, they more or less publicly announced exactly where it was going to happen. I'm not sure. I think the whole counteroffensive trailer and the hype was mainly to build up something to show off to Western contributors of military aid. But do you guys have anything to say about the Russian accomplishments, or just how weird the whole counteroffensive situation was?
Yeah, I'll start on this. So the entire counteroffensive, as has been said 100 times before, was the most telegraphed thing of all time. Everybody knew that this, like, even before the PowerPoint slides got leaked, everybody thought, okay, this strategically makes sense. This is what one of Ukraine's biggest wartime goals is, the recapture of Crimea. That's probably going to be their most likely target, and the easiest, or the best way to do that would be naturally to split the Russian territory that's been captured in two by going to the Sea of Azov and Crimea. So the Russians basically realized this and made UTIS 4321 a defense in depth. The reason we didn't use that term here is because the Russians almost didn't need the extent of defenses that they constructed. I mean, yeah, the Ukrainians didn't even make it to Tokmak, not even halfway to Tokmak. So that's obviously the Russian operational success for the year, is just the prevention of this offensive maneuver.
Okay, and Furious, anything you want to say on the Russian accomplishments in 2023 before we start a detailed full-front review?
No, nothing to add. To a point. I mean, I know it's kind of sometimes it can be sort of seen in many ways, and one will be criticized for stating it one way or the other. But strategic withdrawals or tactical withdrawals are really difficult things to do. They're difficult insofar as they're difficult to justify for your own side, in terms of a withdrawal, a particularly sizable withdrawal, can actually be seen as damaging for morale. Even though if things were to go awry, they could be infinitely worse. But I think actually having the balls to pull that force from across the Dnieper in the Kherson Oblast was, I'll just say it's a decision that was not easy to make, and it could have been mired in all kind of difficulty. But we could see with the Ukrainians increasing degree of competency and decreasing degrees of accuracy, we're actually striking the what's the name of that bridge across the Dnieper? I've just gone blank as to its name, but that famous bridge. Yeah, is it the Antonov Bridge or whatever it is? I can't remember. But and then the Russians would build pontoons, but still they were being targeted. And this is also in some part a part of the Russian problem of having to, because you can see from this map here, these sort of advances, these lines. Just zoom out a little bit more, Charlie. So they actually, quite early in the war, had basically driven up every highway that leads out of Mykolaiv, but didn't actually take the city. And as a result of not taking Mykolaiv, gave the Ukrainians quite a nice forward point in order to solidify defense against Kherson. And so this left the Russian forces on this side vulnerable. And even though the Ukrainians did actually throw significant forces in trying to dislodge the Russians in combat, like ground combat terms, it was the fact that there was this risk of having supply severed that led to the Russian withdrawal, which ended up being a resounding success. If you consider that, at worst, if a withdrawing force is assailed and the pocket is crushed, that's always the biggest fear. But essentially, the Russians left that unscathed, which within the context of a negative decision, it was successful. And then I would agree with Mandrill that the Surovikin line was almost far too elaborate. It wasn't nothing, given its vaunted depth, was even needed. They weren't even the Ukrainians weren't even at risk at reaching Tokmak. So those defensive battles were a success for Russia too. But what I will say is that I have never in all of my adult life encountered something quite so foolish as the Western crowing about the counteroffensive. You know, for anyone who has read anything or knows anything about military history or any kind of understanding of these subjects, the last thing you want is for your opponent to know what you're doing. And Western journalists just got off talking about this over and over and over again. And the Russians knew it was coming. It was the most telegraphed thing I think I've ever seen in like modern military history, and it's just astonishing. And then they carried it through. It was actually it was more obvious than Kursk, you know.
And then on top of that telegraphing from Western media, then the Russians got the leaked PowerPoint slides in which they got extremely detailed information about the formations that were expected to be used in this offensive, like up to and including every single piece of equipment that they were going to have and what was still required to get these formations operational, like what the timelines were in order to get them operational. So, I mean, massive failure on both an OPSEC level and yeah, just
No, it was truly bizarre. I mean, if anything, we could say the Ukrainians were set up for failure in their defense. And we could also say that the Russians clearly overinvested in defense, which I guess also is a way to say, you know, to sort of alleviate the massive failure that was the counteroffensive. If we want to sort of shift fault from the Ukrainians in any way possible, like trying to be as fair as possible, the Ukrainians or the Russians overinvested in defense. I guess we can say that is a pretty big. I guess that's the main summary of the war in 2023 from the Russian side, is that they made the correct decision in switching to defensive measures, but they heavily overinvested in defense, and it was really only the Wagner group that was actually making any serious offensive up until the last few months. That is.
Well, yes, and this is where you start getting into strategic stability. And from the Russian perspective of, okay, you've retreated from Kiev, you've retreated from Kharkiv, you've retreated from Kherson, and now you've retreated from Bakhmut and Soledar the first time. So, of course, the Russians are going to try to invest in holding the territory. And maybe this is a bit of an overcorrection, but in this situation, I would say that a bit of an overcorrection and a bit of an overinvestment in terms of digging trenches and laying mines and that sort of thing and gun emplacements, that's actually worth it to keep the territory you've already got in exchange for the blood that's already been spilled. So you don't want to lose any more from, if you're a Russian, right? You can't politically sustain retreating and falling back from all of these places and then losing, you know, Zaporizhia or losing territory in Donetsk, Luhansk, which is the entire stated reason why you're even engaging in this conflict in the first place.
So actually, interesting comment here about the Surovikin line. So the way the line works is, I don't have a graphic up for this, but most of the line is fixed defenses that aren't necessarily manned, like tank traps and minefields, going for hundreds of meters just out in front. Then you have trench networks that, you know, might be lightly manned, but can be selectively reinforced as attacks manifest. So sure, drones can see it, but for the first line of defense, there's actually nothing to attack because you're just looking at concrete blocks, other types of tank traps, minefields. So there aren't actually people there to bomb within close range, which is how, you know, the Surovikin line isn't just, you know, again, like World War I, like a big trench filled with guys. It's literally kilometers long defense in depth that was built up. So, okay, let's move on to actually the full front review here. So starting out, we'll just go from west to east. Krinky. Krinky's the current place where we're seeing action. Really, the only significant Ukrainian offensive action at the moment is actually this area right here. So the Ukrainians basically drive boats down this route into Krinky and have this little beachhead right here. We've seen some videos of the Russians using drone bombs on the little speedboats in order to kill the reinforcements before they arrive. I guess I'll let. I think we all have similar thoughts on Krinky, but I'll let either of you take away any commentary on Krinky to start out with. So go ahead, someone.
Yeah, I think it's very clear from what we have discussed many times in our group chat that the assault or the amphibious assault on the Dnieper and Krinky by the Ukrainians is obviously in support of the main offensive thrust towards Tokmak. And we all knew that this wasn't the main thrust. This is a secondary effort meant to attempting to draw away Russian resources away from the actual main line of advance. And so this is not even a major area, right? This is a diversion. This is a distraction that Ukraine is trying to use in order to get Russia to shift troops over back towards Kherson.
Right, and it makes sense too. A lot of the pro-Russian commentary sort of just says the Ukrainians are basically just throwing people into the meat grinder, and this is like a pointless operation. I suppose in some sense that's true, but the thing is, you can't just never attack. The Ukrainians, in some sense, have to attack the Russians in one of their most vulnerable points to fix mini brigades in this area, just anticipation that a much larger attack might occur. So the Ukrainians more or less have to launch attacks like this. And of course, the Russians are happy to leave them with a small beachhead that they can actually bomb and attrit the Ukrainians further. So I don't view the attack on Krinky as some sort of a stupid, pointless assault. It's in some sense necessary just in order to keep your options open and to keep the Russians, keep fixed Russian forces in the Kherson region that could otherwise be used across the direct contact front line and other parts of the war. Marcus, you want to add anything on Krinky?
Not necessarily. There's not really a whole lot to say.
Yeah.
Aside from that, it's just another example of the callousness of the regime being willing to just throw lives into another meat grinder. I mean, there is no defensible terrain here. It is amongst a confluence of the Dnieper of the Dnieper River and this marshland, and they're just ferrying over boys for the slaughter. I mean, this is very much a situation where I mean, certainly if one is to take the devil's advocate position here, once all that aid was transferred to Ukraine, what we should have seen was a broad strategy of elastic defense and utilizing these resources and these newly trained troops to form a nucleus of a new army with which Ukraine could at least fight on for an indeterminate but sort of moderate amount of time into the future. And instead they've been flung into these hideously idiotic offenses into essential brick walls. And this Krinky thing is just actually, who wrote it here? I think UT is 431. Yeah, the Ukrainian offensive was a psychological operation. Exactly right. I mean, just to reiterate the point, as you guys already have, these make no military there's no military logic to this. It makes no sense. And in the end, what Ukraine has succeeded in doing is expending its best military assets for naught. And in fact, it has been at a profound loss, both in terms of material, in terms of manpower, in terms of its own prospects. It's actually quite a sad situation for them.
Yeah, one last thing on Krinky. I'll just add that if you're trying to make any sort of diversionary attack, it's got to have at least some perception of success by the enemy for the enemy to react to it. If it's not actually apparent, like at least if it doesn't actually tactically or operationally threaten your opponent, then they're really not going to divert resources to address it, and you're not going to be able to get the space that you need in your the main thrust of your effort.
Well, yeah, and what's weird about this attack is it came very late, really after the counteroffensive had already stalled out. So I find it kind of bizarre that this attack hasn't been happening in coordination with the actual counteroffensive and is now still ongoing after it has failed. I mean, like I said, it makes sense to launch some sort of attacks across the Dnieper just to fix Russian forces. And in terms of where to attack, Krinky makes sense because you have this nice gray zone so that it's much harder for the Russians to spot what you're doing. You've got a sea route that actually goes right to the land as opposed to having to, walk across marshes. And this whole area right here is actually forested. And as we know, forests are pretty much the most dangerous place to fight in this conflict because you don't have drone support overhead, you don't really have armor, and anytime someone is fixed in a forest here, like around Le Mans, there's almost no movement on the front because it's just so difficult for anyone to actually gain ground without taking heavy losses. Because they don't have the support of all the other tools they're relying on. So I think Krinky makes sense as the appropriate target for a Ukrainian amphibious assault. But the thing is, at some point, I mean, how long are you just going to keep throwing men in there? I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay, so
timing's everything.
yeah, and the timing was completely wrong. So moving on to Robotyny, the Russians are, oops, zooming in on the wrong tab here. Moving on to Robotyny, we'll actually put the symbols back on now. There we go. We can see. We'll take off the unit deployments, actually. This map has nice arrows sort of denoting where the Russians are attacking. So the Russians are in the process of trying to take Robotyny back, which is sort of the biggest gain of the counteroffensive. They're now pushing on the very outskirts of the village. And they're also launching assaults to the east. And it's not pictured here, but the Russians are also attacking this area. So they're sort of trying to split the salient in two and then attack Robotyny from both sides. And then once they've done that, let's say that the Russians are able to, control or at least gray zone this territory. Now these units up here can cut these off from behind, and then Robotyny can potentially be double enveloped or encircled as well. So that's what they're attempting to do or pull off here. The Ukrainians managed to take pieces of the front edge of the Surovikin line about right here, and the Russians are basically looking to just cancel out this entire salient, which was, of course, the main sort of theater in more than one sense of the counteroffensive. So that's what's going on in this area of the front. I mean, definitely, many months ago, we could already say that the whole counteroffensive was a massive failure, and this is all that they've managed to develop. And it looks like the Ukrainians will not be able to hold on to this, but they'll probably keep it for a few more months. But at some point, it's not going to be worth keeping your troops here. It should also be noted that this area right here that the Russians have started attacking and capturing is actually a high ground as well, which is also why they're taking it. So it'll give them overwatch on both sides of the salient.
Yeah. Just aside to say that it's it's similar to what we saw in Bakhmut earlier on, as we're sort of seeing develop in Avdiivka now. It almost sort of feels like they just sort of intentionally sort of collapsed part of the line, and they've sort of created because I mean we don't really necessarily know how this played out on the ground, but this could have been, for instance, the heaviest point of the Ukrainian spearhead of the Ukrainian attack, and the Russians have just sort of opened, sort of let the bag collapse in on them, so to speak. And it kind of just feels like another fire trap that is being laid here. And as the Russians have done before, they'll just pour munitions and artillery into this salient, and the Ukrainians will feel compelled to reinforce it, and we'll have a rinse and repeat. It appears as if the Russians know this tactic works, so they're employing it. Once again. I mean, they've essentially got the Ukrainians enveloped on three sides at that point in that little salient.
Exactly. So moving on to Velka Novoselika, the Ukrainians achieved actually really greater success in this region. Currently, what the Russians are trying to do is to basically reverse the gains of the Ukrainians, and they've actually recently taken sort of this territory back right here, and they're trying to take back Staromayorsk from the Ukrainians right now by sort of doing their traditional envelopment tactics, and then their ultimate goal is going to be to restabilize the front line to where more or less where it was before. So currently, Ukrainians are holding the Russians back. It doesn't really seem like these are major areas of operations for the Russians. I don't think they're clearly not particularly concerned about taking this territory back in any quick time frame. I don't really have anything to say on Velika Novoselica other than we can also say that the counteroffensive in this whole region was also stopped, and it seems like the Russians are going to be slowly but surely reversing the gains at this point. And then moving on, things get a little more interesting here. So, of course, we have the Ugladar area that the Russians have been trying to capture forever. I mean, basically, what's going on with Ugladar is roughly like pretty much the whole thing. It's like this tiny little cluster of apartment buildings. And one thing we've noticed in the war that is worth commenting on is anywhere you have a sort of grouping of high-rise buildings, it's extremely difficult to assault. And one of the things about Ugladar is that most of the area around Ugladar is just open fields going on for kilometers. We can see the distance there. So the Ukrainians can pretty much see everything the Russians are doing if they have troops in these high-rise buildings. I guess one of the questions I've asked is why have the Russians just not demolished these buildings? Maybe they just don't think it's worth expending the munitions necessary to do that. Maybe the Soviet construction might be harder to collapse than we might think, and it would just be too costly to actually try and bring down these buildings. Maybe the Russians themselves want to take this position rather than completely destroy it. I don't know, but we can definitely note that anywhere there's high-rise buildings, like apartment blocks, basically, it's the best defensive position you could possibly have because it seems virtually unassailable.
What's the distance from Ugladar to the Russian forward line there?
Let's see.
How many kilometers is that?
This tool's so weird. There we go. 1 kilometer, roughly 2 kilometers, depending.
Jeez, that's nothing.
Yeah, no, they're very close.
Strange.
Yes, it really seems, and the Russians have made several major efforts to take Ugladar, and they've taken the villages around it, but they simply cannot take Ugladar itself, even though they've tried numerous times. So my read on this is that high-rise buildings are just OP, especially when they're in a region like this that's pretty flat, and there's nothing obstructing the view. And I'm also just assuming that it's either far too difficult or simply not worth the munitions to actually bomb them into oblivion and collapse the buildings themselves. And there are quite a lot of them. I mean, we can see most of these structures, the lines basically are apartment complexes. So if you wanted to actually take out this position, you would have to use an enormous amount of ordnance to actually destroy the buildings. So I think that's although nothing has developed there are things developing adjacent to it that will matter because the Russians have managed to, let's zoom out a bit so we can get the location. So here's Donetsk city.
Just before we move on, Charlie, can I just ask a quick question about Ugladar? Just because Theodore Ganymede asked a good question. How's the terrain to the northwest of Ugladar? Because I know you've used terrain maps before. Do you have one on hand, Molly, or do we not know what the terrain is around Ugladar? Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I don't know offhand. I haven't actually looked in that direction. Let's see.
There you go. Well, Vuldar, according to Ukrainian.
Yeah, whatever. I mean, it looks similar.
There it is. There's a V and no G. Yeah, that's it. You got it right there.
Yeah, there's no highway connecting it in that direction though, which I'll actually mention now. So one of the big developments is the Russians have also finally taken Marinka, more or less completely. Actually,
or what's left of
Marinka, it's not quite. Yeah, we can't see it yet, but Marinka doesn't really exist anymore. It's basically just rubble. So this is not like
a very
city.
Very hard fall over battle.
Yes, but the Russians have finally taken the pile of rubble that is Marinka, and this is relevant because what this is enabling them to do is they've actually developed pretty far south at this point. And they're trying to also take Novomykhailivka now. The Russians have advanced pretty far in this area to attempt to do an envelopment of Novohomolika, and they're unable to complete that envelopment from the north because there's a Ukrainian stronghold right here. So what we're looking at is basically if the Russians can encircle this and or otherwise drive the Ukrainians out, they'll be able to envelop this town and then sort of do a similar thing as they're doing in Marinka, which is try and move west. Because what the Russians are actually doing here is they want to collapse Ugladar by cutting off its supply routes. Because the only supply routes in the Ugladar are this road, which is basically under fire control by the Russians, and this road, which is not. So you actually mark it here. So this road is not. So the Russian goal is basically to control this line we have on screen, or just cut it off at any point to the northeast of Ugladar. So if the Russians can take this area, basically Ugladar will be much more difficult to supply, and then they will probably attempt to actually, attrit it over time and eventually take it. And of course, in order to take this area, they're also going to have to drive the Ukrainians out of these territories as well to facilitate those maneuvers. Ultimately, their goal in this area is to drive the Ukrainians more or less back to a new defensive line around this city. So the developments in Marinka have been interesting because they've been fighting over this for like a year now, but they are actually finally succeeding. They're pushing on the north and south of these lakes, and this may ultimately crack the nut of Ugladar in 2024. So yeah, this is pretty significant.
And the thing is, too, according to from reports we've seen and other people's opinions, and even just by going off the map, the Ukrainians don't really have much of a fallback position, beyond Ugladar. It sort of seems that for them to establish a line of defense is going to actually be quite hard. If you sort of look in that northwesterly direction, there's sort of nothing until Novoukrainka and Bohoylavenka, which I don't know if you got the measuring thing there, Charlie, on the other map, but so if you draw a triangle from Ugladar to Bohoylavenka and Novoukrainka, a triangle from Vuladar.
Oh yeah, I'm just trying to find the other ones. There we go.
That's all good. Yeah.
And then
so what's that? Yeah. So that's area distance 34. So Harvard. So I was going to say the first one actually said 23 kilometers. So I think like 23 and maybe 15 or something. There's 15 kilometers. Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, basically, they want to collapse the Russian. They want to collapse the front like this.
Yeah.
And it's really only Ugladar standing in the way here, which can't be taken directly. So that's why they're having it develop here. But the Russians are basically trying to massively collapse the Ukrainian front in this area by taking these defensible positions and giving them no choice but to fall back much further. This is
a great way of dealing with the Ugladar problem, which is how does one take a fortress from two different directions at once for both sides?
Yeah, that's exactly what they're doing. They've clearly given up on trying to take it through frontal assaults, and are now trying to develop the other fronts. And of course, that's if they can take Ugladar, this will facilitate the same maneuver on Velka Novoselika. So, yeah, if the Russians can achieve significant success in sort of this area, it will actually cause the Ukrainian front to really collapse back to more like this point, which would be pretty significant. So we'll see how that develops in 2024. They're also assaulting Krasnogorivka as well, although not as extensively as they were else, but we're probably going to see similar action as in Marinka, sort of in this area as things develop. But so far, we've only seen minor attacks there. And of course, moving on to the big event, I guess, of the winter and fall is Avdiivka. So Avdiivka is significant because it's one of the places where it's really the last remaining place where the Ukrainians can shell the center of Donetsk. If we actually look at the very front line here and draw a line to the city center of Donetsk, it's only I can't read it again. What does it say? Is it like 10 kilometers, I think? stupid sharing thing is in the way. So if the Russians can take Avdiivka, then the front line will be more like here, and the Ukrainians won't be able to shell the city center of Donetsk anymore, which will be a big deal because it'll relieve a lot of pressure on the population center there, and give the Russians the ability to build up their forces more for larger assaults, because right now they can't really do that in the city itself.
And that's a
So,
prime position to do that. That's a highway right there going to the west, if I'm not mistaken.
right, yeah, it
Which
is.
is
That's
which
one of the
is
major highways.
which of course in armor doctrine, what you do with armored forces is you send two parallel highways, or you get two armored forces on two parallel highways. So if you can take Avdiivka way that they're using to outflank Uglitar with, so you absolutely want that.
Yes, and as in terms of any big maneuvering, this is going to be very tough for the Russians to crack if they want to pull off any maneuvers like that. But we can see these major arteries heading west is sort of ultimately the big operational goal of this region, because if they're looking to take Zaporizhia, they're going to need this entire artery basically in order to do that. So all of this is sort of leading into that assault probably years down the line at this point. But yes, so back to Avdiivka itself. That's sort of how it plays into the larger strategic situation. But the Russians have, for a long time, been assaulting it from the south here. The issue is these fields are heavily mined, and sort of there was a major bombardment like 2 or so months ago, where the Russians unleashed very intense artillery bombardments on the region, and then they sort of launched some fairly large armored assaults to Severnay, but these were stopped by the sheer number of mines in these fields. The Russians have not been able to make a breakthrough because there's too many mines, there's no cover, you only have these minor tree lines. If you look at the terrain, it's just totally open. They can be seen by the citadel here, which is again these high-rise buildings, and of course the coke plant, which is up in this area. So these assaults have basically failed. The Russians have secured themselves, though, on the flank as far to the west as Pervomaiska. This flank is not really fully developed yet because they're going to have to basically close off this salient in order to really secure this position for an actual envelopment of Avdiivka. More of the action has been on the north at this point, where the Russians like to do this thing where they develop on long rail lines. That's what this is right here. There's a rail line, and then there's another rail line right here. And you can see they come together in this sort of junction right here. Basically, the Russians are trying to take this area because this area is forested. You can see there's a tree line along the rail line that sort of protects their positions. And if they can take this area right here, that'll give them a very strong position from which to do flanking attacks on the north of Avdiivka. So that's basically their operational goal. They took Krasnohorivka earlier this year and are basically expanding in every single direction out from it in order to develop this position. And of course, they've also started. This front's actually pretty interesting. They managed a little breakthrough in this industrial area right here. The position of the front line has been the same for like 8 years, which has been right here. But just in the last few months, the Russians have managed to take this, which is significant. There's a little old, I think this is an old air base in this area right here. That's another Ukrainian strong point. And right now, the Russians are trying to basically envelop that from both sides. I think this is the air base right here. But basically, the Russians need to envelop that from both the east, which is the purpose of this attack, and also the west. And as you can see, the Ukrainians are actually holding pretty strong in this area that they actually counterattacked in order to prevent that from happening. Because if this air base is taken, then the Russians will be able to close the distance and take all the suburbs around the actual citadel area. And of course, there's another Ukrainian fortification. I think like here is another strong point that they have. I think this is actually like a hotel, if I remember correctly. But But anyway, this attack, the purpose of this attack is to come behind this position and assault it from the rear by taking these routes on sort of the suburban outskirts. And then once they do that, it'll be just a few more suburbs left, and then they can get to the citadel. I guess what I expect to happen on this front is, again, not a big encirclement of Avdiivka, which they tried to do, but they simply cannot break through either of these areas. I think what they're ultimately going to do is take the coke plant in a head-on attack, which they're attempting to do, and then take these fortifications, and then they will probably simply encircle the citadel itself, or leave a small route open, like they did with Bakhmut, either intentionally or because they couldn't take it. So this is a pretty interesting battle. The Ukrainians, I guess we can get into some articles here if you want. Mandrill, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. So I noticed this article because it was published yesterday, and of course this is from Forbes about the Leopard 2s and where they are. So we discussed the 47th Brigade, right? This is the transfer of these Leopard 2s to the 47th Mechanized. That's a notable brigade because we went over the PowerPoint slides, and the 47th Brigade wasn't actually originally equipped with Leopard 2s. That was a different brigade. The 47th was supposed to have the M55S, which is the Slovenian, I think. Slovenian T-55, Israeli upgraded T-55, basically. So it's interesting that this brigade is being given, or is reputed to have been given, Leopard 2 A6s. But why? Either it's attrition, where they've lost their S's for one reason or another, and they need tanks because otherwise they're going to be combat ineffective, and so they're being forcibly transferred to this brigade, or they're just doing a switcheroo in order for like rotation or some such. But this is interesting because why exactly? And I think that if you're Ukraine, this is an asset that is nigh irreplaceable for you. It's very good. It's going to be very difficult for you to replace, right? The Germans have, and the Canadians and the Portuguese and all of these other places have given relatively small quantities of this extremely expensive, high maintenance, although relatively high value unit. So where do you commit these to battle? And as it says, as you have highlighted that right there, no one's pledged more of the Striv 122s. The Striv 122 is basically a Swedish version of a Leopard 2. It's like qualitatively slightly upgraded. I can't speak to the quality of the Striv 122 necessarily, but so these assets are basically irreplaceable. They're one-off things. So after the Ukrainian offensive in the summer, they lost several of these, and they decided, okay, we can't lose any more of these because if you start attriting them, they're gone for good. It's you don't get any more. So the fact that they're committing these things to the 47th Brigade is pretty substantial. Because if you're fighting in Avdiivka, or if you're fighting wherever the 47th Brigade is deployed at, that sounds like it's a very critical area, and you're going to need these assets to go there. This is where one of those little like open source articles that I just find interesting because it makes you ask a lot of follow-on questions.
One thing I forgot to mention, actually, which Jimmy Thomas brought up in chat, is actually this rail line, which I think is what he noticed. So one of the main reasons the Russians want to take this whole area around Marinka and Ugledar is actually to secure this rail line. If you look, there aren't a whole lot of rail lines, actually, that major rail lines, at least, that go through the area Russia has conquered. There's really only just this one. And At least that goes through Kherson and Zaporozhye. So this one part of the rail line is actually pretty exposed because if we look at the front line, minimum distance is the stupid thing. Minimum distance is only 6 kilometers. So you can imagine if the Russians were able to take Ugladar and push the Ukrainians far back, and the distance to the rail line was more like 20 kilometers, then the Russians could actually more reliably use this route in order to send supplies west and east along their, basically most critical area. So that's sort of one of the main reasons the Russians are so interested in this area as well, is because of how exposed their rail is at the moment.
Yeah, you're basically conquering territory so that you put your own rail line out of range of enemy artillery strikes.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, it's very interesting that the Leopard A2s have been committed to this area of the front because it sort of highlights the significance that the Ukrainians attached to Avdiivka. Um, the Ukrainians seem to be setting up another Bakhmut type situation where they're going to be willing to hold this at all costs until the Russians eventually overwhelm it. So I suspect we're basically going to see a repeat of Bakhmut around Avdiivka, where ultimately the Russians are going to, encroach from here on the citadel, and then encroach these dodges and suburbs, and directly assault this citadel as well, and then take Avdiivka. And that's going to be a pretty big deal for the Russian side because it's going to secure Donetsk. It's going to, and then that will allow them to do build-ups in Donetsk more safely without being so directly exposed to Ukrainian intelligence and artillery fire. Because the Ukrainians can just launch FPV drones from Avdiivka and just look at everything going on in Donetsk city if they want, which is obviously a big problem for the Russians. So I think, this is a very interesting front to look at. There's really no sign that the Ukrainians can hold out here. I think pretty much any honest person is going to look at what's going on in Avdiivka and acknowledge that it's simply not possible for the Ukrainians to hold this ultimately. But it does look like they're going to repeat the Bakhmut situation.
Yeah, this is where you start discussing the Ukrainian perspective and why exactly they feel obligated to hold these major towns. And I would suggest that the reason why you're holding these towns is because that's where the terrain is. That's the defensible terrain. Cities, as you've mentioned, are kind of OP. Apartment blocks sound like they're kind of OP. Forests are incredibly important. And so if you can get an urban center surrounded on one flank or two flanks by water features and by forests, etc., that make it logistically, or it's just defensible terrain, that's good. So if you're Ukraine, you're looking to keep just enough of a defensive barrier where, okay, I know that this front is going to be stable, and I know that where the Russians are likely to attack, right? That makes it a lot easier for your maneuver elements, for your armor forces, etc., to be deployed. And so from Ukraine's point of view, holding Bakhmut, as gruesome as that was, and as lengthy as that was, kind of makes sense. Because if you're holding a defensive line, you need to hold that line essentially. And really, what Ukraine is doing, given the dearth of heavily urban terrain to the west, and I should say to the east of the Dnieper until you get actually to Zaporizhia proper, is you don't really have a whole lot of places where you don't have these areas that have been constructed and prepared for since 2014. So literally almost a decade of defensive preparations have gone into this. So if you're Ukraine, you need to be able to hold these positions for as long as possible so that you have enough time to build your next defensive position in the West, right? So you just need to hold these for as long as possible.
Yeah, that's the idea. I mean, these positions have been developed since 2014. So these are among the strongest defensive positions the Ukrainians actually have in terms of how well constructed they are. And there's tunnel systems and all of that. So it makes even more sense than for Bakhmut for the Ukrainians to hold this territory, especially since it's directly adjacent to the enemy capital. Donetsk is essentially the capital city of this entire war on the Russian side, and Avdiivka is directly bordering it. So, I think it makes even more sense to hold Avdiivka than Bakhmut, and I don't think the Ukrainians are actually making the wrong decision in trying to hold out as long as they possibly can in this territory, because obviously once it collapses, that's going to open up a lot of logistical possibilities for the Russians. So, but it is clear that Avdiivka is ultimately going to fall at this point. And yeah, you mentioned that the whole cities and apartment complexes thing. I mean, basically, this whole area here is just empty fields with mines in them. So this is a really good defensible position because it's pretty much impossible to actually assault it from anywhere to its west. And you could only really assault it east of the line I have here. So it makes it much easier to actually defend. So very sensible for the Ukrainians, I think, to actually try and hold that. Marcus,
The only thing I will say is that the only thing with Bakhmut is that given the location of the river that's in front of the city and the high ground which surrounded it, territorially speaking, even though Bakhmut was a meat grinder and probably a meat grinder Ukraine overinvested in to a point, there were terrain purposes for defending Bakhmut, and I think also because there was that entire line. Let's just go back to that map. I don't forget the names of places. There's sort of like entire line of defenses that were built from where are we? From around like Solidar through down to Zadzaiva and just north of Horlivka, essentially down to Bakhmut, Klishkivka. There's a whole, essentially that was sort of like a real center point of Ukrainian defense. And Bakhmut was the center of that, and it was the most concentrated, node of those defenses. From what we know about what happened there. So, in that sense, it was a logical thing to defend where they did and for as long as they did. And I think also the strength of those defenses were proven in the ability for the Ukrainians to hold out, despite the firepower disparity and the fact that the Russians did, use an awful lot of ordnance in the Bakhmut operation.
So let's move on. One thing we did see is the Ukrainians sort of launch a small assault just from the New York area toward Golivka, where they took basically one of those basically giant dumping sites. They have these giant mounds right where industrial waste is basically dumped, and the Ukrainians took one of those hills somewhere in this area, and then that was repulsed by the Russians within a few days or weeks. So turns out nothing really happened there, but the Ukrainians were just sort of making another attack just to try and fix Russian forces probably away from Avdiivka and towards Gorliivka here in order to defend against what could have been a much larger attack. But perhaps it was even just a lucky strike on the Ukrainians' part. It's really hard to say, but nothing ended up happening there. So we can go look at Bakhmut. So yeah, the Ukrainians took back some territory in the north in their counteroffensive, and actually pretty large part of the territory around Bakhmut in their counteroffensive. They were basically trying to, repeat what the Russians did and just do their own encirclement of Bakhmut just from the other direction. Obviously, that failed. What's significant now is if we look at Google Maps again, actually, and go to Bakhmut, we can see the defenses around Klishivka. So Klishivka is in like a valley, basically, and this site overlooks Klishivka, and the Russians are in the process of taking these fortified positions on this hill. What that's going to enable them to do is ultimately retake Klishivka and Andreevka here. And what the Russians are looking to do here is basically move the front back to where it was before along this canal, which is more defensible. The Russians are also, interestingly, developing North Bakhmut, because if you recall, the Wagner forces never actually took Kromova. But the Russians now have actually taken Kromova, and even more than that, taken sort of some of the critical trench networks to its north. And as we can actually see here, are actually even on the outskirts of Bodanivka now, and actually entering Bodanivka from the north, which they didn't manage to do during the attempted encirclement of Bakhmut. And what this is ultimately aimed at is once they sort of restore their positions around, once they take Klashivka, the Ukrainians will have to fall back to Ivaniska, which is sort of their main defensive hub, sort of the forward position from Chasiv Yar. So, and then of course, north, the Russians are assaulting both Bodanivka. So, of course, obviously, the plan here is the Russians are going to take this Bodanivka village. They're going to take Klashivka back. And the Russians, of course, are also actually assaulting these dachas just outside of Bakhmut, which they also did not take during the battle, if I remember correctly. So obviously what's happening here is the Russians are planning on doing a double envelopment of Ivanivska to take it. And again, move the defensive line all the way to this canal and then probably halt there rather than assault Chasiv Yar. But it's clear that the Russians are looking to basically make this front more defensible so that they, probably can start building up in Bakhmut for a larger assault, in any number of directions that could go from here. Anything y'all want to add on this front?
No, not really good. I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Charlie, unless Mandrill wants to come in.
No, I'm good.
Okay. So, yeah, the Russians are making minor assaults towards Seversk, mostly here, attempting to potentially, envelop this village here. They're just trying to, widen the gap between some of these villages they've captured and Seversk. Ultimately, they're going to attempt to take Seversk. Fighting, as I mentioned earlier, in forests is basically at a standstill. They've been fighting in this forest around Liman for years at this point. And, or I guess, okay, more than 1 year, but not 2 years. And it basically hasn't moved. Neither have things moved. I forget. They have like the Ukrainian version of that town's name on this map. What is the name of there it is. I only Bilahorivka, yeah.
Bilahorivka, yeah.
So the Russians have been trying to assault this for a long time too. There's like a quarry here, and we don't see much development happening here, but the Russians are pushing on this part of the front. The Russians have made some significant gains sort of in this area around Liman, or what we call the Crimea front, basically to try and push the front back to the Zerbets River, I believe is what this river is called. Yeah. So this is sort of one line the Russians want to secure before they ultimately try and push all the way back to the Oskol River. But obviously, if the Russians can secure this line, that will give them a better defensive position and maybe finally open up the ability to take Seversk. And then, of course, the Russians are trying to undo the embarrassment of that initial Ukrainian counteroffensive and push all the way back to the Oskol River. They've been trying to take Kupiansk for a long time. They've been assaulting this way. They've been assaulting from the north. The movement is very slow here. It is going in the Russian direction, or Russian favor rather, but ultimately it's very, very slow. And Kupiansk is almost certainly going to end up being another Bakhmut. The Ukrainians absolutely do not want the Russians to re-anchor themselves on the Oskol River. So we can expect, I think, the Ukrainians to hold out in Kupiansk as long as possible. And yeah, the successes on this front have been very minimal. So yeah, that's basically the overview of the whole front line as it currently is. Do you guys want to add any of that? Do we have any articles we haven't mentioned yet? Actually, we do. So what else should we look at? Let's start with the drones. We haven't actually commented on this, but you linked this article, Mandrill.
Yeah, so this is interesting because we hear a lot about how, and we'll get into this with the Russian casualties and why I tend to raise an eyebrow to some of these casualty figures. And really it comes down to firepower, right? Okay, Ukraine is using terrain, but Russia has superior firepower. So this is superior number of drones. That is also including, kamikaze drones, things like Lancet, Giron, etc., Shahed. So Ukraine has a superiority in drones. Russia has a superiority in drones, 5-1 or 7-1. This is what a Ukrainian is telling us. Yeah, the Russians have superiority in artillery. They have numerical superiority, at least in terms of equipment and tanks and that sort of thing. Really, war becomes logistics. You can fight as hard and as bravely as you want, but eventually the weight of numbers does begin to matter. And that's especially true if you have a massive differential in firepower. So I think, so thank you for linking the casualty article here. So the casualty article is that we've got, supposedly Russia has 315,000 dead and injured. So that's dead and injured, right? I'm sure we could do a little bit of math here to figure out what the total KIA number is. If Jimmy Thomas's numbers are correct, you have about 5 times the amount of wounded as KIA. So if that's all told dead and injured, you're probably looking at, maybe 60, 70,000 guys at most. Let's do 315,000 divided by 5. What's that? Yeah, 63,000 men. Okay, so you're looking about 60 to 70,000 K on the Russian side at this point, if this figure is correct.
Yeah, as far as the figure goes, I mean, they mentioned here that basically 90% of Russia's personnel. I don't know. You could probably reduce that if you count for people injured multiple times, but I'm pretty skeptical of the idea that 90% of their initial forces have been injured. That seems ridiculously high, to be honest. But I don't know. Do you guys have any opinions on that?
Unless you're counting minor injuries as well, not just people who are getting, shot in the chest and then 6 months after a lung collapse or whatever, they've, recovered.
Yeah, I mean, that's literally never happened in the history of warfare.
This is counting colds and flus and like nail infections, and
it's like if you take 90% casualties, like your civilization's over. So this number seems highly inflated to me, but that's all we can really say. Mainly based on this fact. I mean, obviously, this is talking about what it had when the conflict began. As far as I know, Russia hasn't majorly increased that number. So, yeah.
Well,
I think,
that's actually kind of not true insofar that, remember, they did mobilize 300 odd thousand, and then according to Russian sources, they did say that they had 80 to 90,000 volunteers as well, and that then after that, I can't remember what the legislation was, but Putin did actually pass, had something passed through the Duma whereby I think the Russian armed forces was increased by 1.5 fold in terms of its standing size. So, I mean, it is worth saying that the Russian forces have officially been expanded, both in terms of mobilized reserves and as in its standing numerical strength as well.
I don't think they're actually deployed, though, are they?
Yes. So it's a question. It's a question of deployed. It's a question of deployed. And
yeah, so, but they're using the phraseology here of hang on, the article's just gone. But basically, it was like initial total strength before the conflict broke out. Yeah, so whether we're comparing initial totals with current totals, and we don't really know what either of them are.
Well, I don't think it could be more than 600,000 deployed in Ukraine. And even if that was the case, we'd still be looking at like 45% casualties, which I guess is more reasonable, but still seems kind of absurdly high.
Yeah, still outlandish either which way, especially given how casualty shy the Russians have been. I mean, they've demonstrated time and again that, aside from some of those particularly tough battles, where was it? It was around, trying to think what that little salient was, the outbreak of this last offensive that just took place. Trying to think of what it was called. Around like Rivnopil and Novopil, just to the west of Staromayorsk. But aside from sort of incidental little incidents like that, the Russians have very much proven time and again that they'd rather withdraw and rather than leave a pile of dead bodies. I mean, we've seen it several times in this conflict alone.
Yeah, so we have another update here. This is the UK's Ministry of Defense. They're claiming that the number of Russian daily casualties killed and wounded has risen by almost 300 per day as compared to 2022. I don't know what the baseline is. Obviously, 300 a day increase alone is crazy because that gives us over 100,000 casualties a year. Um, so we're saying that's more or less in line with the numbers we're seeing. I guess if we run the calculations, if we take 300,000 casualties, it'd be about 300 casualties per day 2022, 600 casualties per day in 2023, which again seems kind of absurdly high because, like we said, this is not a World War I style war where you're just seeing mass artillery bombardments nonstop against massed infantrymen in trenches. I would say we could almost cut this by like 90%. It'd probably be more accurate, but that's just kind of a guess. But
I mean,
it's
at
just-
least
so
half,
this is-
to be honest, at least half.
This is interesting too because when we heard last year the Ukrainians had a leak where they were discussing losing 100 to 200 guys a day. So if these are the kinds of numbers that we're working with, which is somewhere between 100 to 300, this is the daily count. Like obviously this is going to fluctuate depending on how intense the action is, right? So if you're in a heavy fighting, or if you're engaging in forward momentum and attacks, you'd expect that in the initial attack, you're going to take a heavier casualty rate per day. And then once you actually get to the exploitation phase or the breakthrough phase, then you're going to have a lesser casualty rate.
Yeah, and I guess just my assumptions on the real casualty rate is just based on these numbers being impossibly high. Like unless the Russians have secretly deployed, 1 or 2 million men in Ukraine, and we just don't know about that. There's absolutely no way they can sustain these casualties. So the numbers just don't add up. Let's see. Okay, so now we'll move on. We'll close out with some current news. So the Biden admin, as their last act of the year, basically is going to be doing another drawdown from the Department of Defense. It's the 44th one, and they're sending 250 million. Yeah, sorry, 54th of aid to Ukraine. This is basically pre-existing material. It's not a newly passed aid. But it's $250 million worth of equipment, which is actually not that much. And it's mostly from this list, it's mostly just things to sort of keep the lights running. We've just got anti-aircraft missiles.
Mostly ammo.
Yeah, mostly artillery, 50 million rounds of ammunition. We could probably even run some basic math, and if you're an autist, and calculate, what percentage of that 250 million is in each of these. It doesn't say
that's
the
easy.
number of rounds.
That's easy. A 7.62 round is about $1 a piece, and a 5.56 round is what, 50, 60, maybe 75 cents a piece. So you could easily say, all right, well, that's at least 1 million rounds of 7.62, or 15 million rounds, and whatever the differential is for 5.56 rounds, right? And of course, if you're talking 50 cal, that's what, $2, $3 a pop. That's not small arms, that's crew serve. But anyway, you get the point, right? So it's at least around 10 to 15 million rounds.
And then we have we have the number of rounds. We would just calculate the cost out, so that would leave us like still over 200 million for the rest of these components. You got your HIMARS missiles, Stingers, TOW missiles, which are basically more anti-tank missiles. Nothing game-changing here. Like I said, this just looks like they're keeping the lights on until they can convince the Congress to actually send a much larger aid package. And then, of course, the other really interesting thing is this missile attack. So, of course, Russia's always running out of missiles. These are so annoying. Russia's always running out of missiles. I don't have ad blocker on this browser. Russia's always running out of missiles, but somehow they're able to launch the biggest missile attack of the entire war. I think on the 28th, or it might have been the 29th. It's hard to. It's like a pretty big time zone difference. So it was either the 28th or 29th, which is 2 days ago roughly. They launched a massive missile barrage, mostly on Kiev. One of the missiles has allegedly flown through Polish airspace, probably on accident, but who knows whether or not that really happened. Of course, you have NAFO people who are totally deranged saying we need to start World War III because a Russian missile flew over the edge of Polish territory, because that's totally sane. But in any case, yeah, it's clear that Russia's not running out of missiles. We could also say that Ukraine is not running out of air defenses because they shot down most of the missiles, I believe. So there you go.
Well, okay, so this is interesting too because the Russians are posting footage of their warships underway, launching caliber missiles, etc., which is partially what some of these strikes are going to be naturally. So the interesting thing about these missiles, right, and when you just have this discussion about, missiles, that, well, okay, what's a missile, right? If you're counting a drone, a Shahed or a Giran 2 drone as a missile or some kind of, deployed asset that goes kaboom when it strikes a target, then it becomes very easy to say, Russia's running out of missiles, right? And of course, even here it says, there's this many cruise missiles, this many drones, right? So the issue with drones and missiles is that drones are cheap. And so if you're in an attrition phase, you're going to use your cheap drones first to attrite your enemy's ammo supply so that when it's actually time to launch the long range, precision guided, land attack missiles like a Caliber or, an Onyx or whatever, those things have larger warheads typically, so you're going to use those. You want those to hit, and they're longer range, and you don't have to deploy them from, or you can deploy some of them from long range bombers like the Tu-22 or the Tu-95. So yeah, you can get them deep inside of Ukrainian territory, like in Lvov or definitely in Kyiv. So what's the point of all of this stuff in terms of air power, and what kind of targets is Russia going to be attacking right now? Right. So Reuters, obviously, here you can see they're attacking the energy system because it's midwinter, and they're trying to do the same thing as they did last year. It's always about attacking critical infrastructure. You're attacking headquarters buildings, command and control structures, disrupting electronic communications, that sort of thing, and logistical hubs and supply hubs. So what exactly is the point of all of this stuff? What are the Russians planning on doing with this? I would say, considering that the Russians are beginning to make some forward movement in certain places, this seems fairly well timed to support that. And you want to disrupt all of these logistics and communications, etc., so that when you're actually moving towards the front line, your headquarters or logistical support, rear echelon troops aren't going to be able to keep the Ukrainians well supplied as they need to be. So that makes your forward motion a lot easier. So that's usually why you would do that at this time, at least from a purely military and not a propaganda perspective.
Yeah, and of course the Russians are actually moving forward as we sort of reviewed. They're actually pretty much on a full frontal assault to the extent that such terminology applies in a war like this. They are on the attack in pretty much every sector of the front, which is interesting and pretty much expected. It's basically a repeat of the Russian winter attacks from last year. I think moving forward, what we can expect to see is the Ukrainian 2024 will probably look mostly like a repeat of 2023, with Russia taking Avdiivka, maybe some smaller settlements, probably closing the salients, maybe advancing more toward Kupiansk. I don't think we're going to see the big arrow offensives in 2024. But I think what's going to happen is somewhere the at some point the Ukrainian army is going to break down, simply because there are not enough men or ammunition or some other critical shortage, and it's going to be in a certain sector of the front, right? It's not going to be, you're not going to see the entire front collapse, but at some point the Russians are going to achieve a breakthrough somewhere. Maybe it's over here, and what's going to happen is the Russians are then going to be able to actually advance many kilometers across the country with their armor, and likely you'll start to see a big arrow maneuver again, where they actually come in and encircle a large part of the Ukrainian army. I think that's kind of what we can expect in terms of war-ending maneuvers. I don't think we're going to see that in 2024, because I think the Ukrainians have demonstrated that they can actually hold out, and even launch minorly successful offensives for much longer than the Russians may have thought. But I do think the war is ultimately trending in that direction, where at some point, some sector of the front is going to experience a major collapse, and then we're going to see a huge Russian maneuver take place that's going to be decisive, right? That's what the Russians are looking for, is something decisive. 2024, I do not think is going to be decisive. You can imagine, I guess one of the ways the World War One analogy somewhat applies is in 1914, you saw, major offensives by the German army. They were sort of pushed back by the French and the British, similar to what happened to the Russians, and lost a significant amount of territory. And then pretty much from 1915 to 17, the front line on the Western Front basically didn't change at all. And then finally in 1918, you see major maneuvers begin again. So I think 2024 will be another year where we really see very little happen in terms of the front changing, other than attrition happening. Like, yeah, they might take Avdiivka, but if we zoom out to the larger perspective, this line is basically going to more or less look like it is for 2024. What do you guys think about the war moving forward?
Go ahead, Furious.
I think at some point we've obviously seen an expansion of the Russian armed forces through this year as a combination of 3 points. One, on paper, via Putin and via the Duma, to actually expand the Russian armed forces, as a top-down sort of order. And then we've seen the mobilization of Russian reserves in concert with a fairly sizable influx of volunteers. And I kind of think that what we have seen up to date is that the Russians are quite happy to sort of, to use a boxing analogy, go the distance. They're quite willing to draw this out. And they have obviously, from what we've seen, given the Russian resilience from the Western sanctions, and also the fact that despite a lot of Western speculation, they have not run out of missiles. They have not run out of artillery shells. They have not essentially run out of equipment. They're not upturning white goods to extract their microchips out of them. It seems as that, in fact, Russian forces are quite well supplied. They're quite well equipped. They're not certainly not wanting for anything essential. And they have plenty of the things that they actually need in terms of maintaining combat effectiveness with munitions and such. And as the Russians as for the Ukrainians, to their credit, have adapted given their limitations. The Russians too have adapted given what they've confronted, given they have been essentially fighting a sort of a NATO proxy at this point. We have seen adaptation on their part, and we'll probably see more of it in 2024. I dare say probably something, and this is where I will have to confess to an error of judgment on my part. I kind of thought that 2023 would actually see a big arrow offensive. Particularly, I thought the Russians would lurch towards the Dnipro, but that was prior to their loss of Izium. Because you can sort of see here, had they actually retained certainly, Kupiansk, Izium, and Balaklia, that sort of almost creates like a meta cauldron of sorts. We sort of see like this small cauldron around Seversk here, just what is essentially east of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. But Izium to I suppose what you could say Volodar in the south represents, like a large salient, sort of, actually probably not too dissimilar to the Kursk salient of World War II. I kind of imagined that they would try to make it to the Dnieper River this year, which they haven't done, and that's something of an L on my part. Whether we see it in 2024, I don't know. If it happens, I wouldn't be surprised. But then if it doesn't happen, I also wouldn't be surprised. But I think it's a case of the Russians will wait until they feel that the Ukrainian army is fundamentally broken. Because if we wind back to the last time we've had a conventional war in Europe, I mean, one only has to look at the performance of the Wehrmacht even in 1944-45, where it was a fundamentally broken force, particularly after operations Bagration and Overlord. They being the offensive operations, both east and west, respectively. The Germans actually fought on, and I mean, the Ukrainian army isn't the Wehrmacht of World War II. It's not a world-leading, potentially world-beating army, but the Ukrainians are well-motivated. They're certainly, the initial army was relatively well-trained, and they are fighting for their territory, which always compels a man to fight harder than he otherwise would. But needless to say, the point I'm trying to make is that even an army that is fundamentally broken and on the back foot and reeling, when sufficiently motivated and given sort of variables, whether it's terrain or whether it's the composition of the enemy, if they're exhausted at the end of their supply, whatever, an armed force in that situation can still fight dangerously, they can still fight capably, they can still inflict losses. And so given Russian experiences both in this war and also probably in analyzing their own combat history, going back, to which I include World War II, the Russians will know that playing a waiting game suits them. If they can just gradually grind down the Ukrainian army and inflict a steady trickle of manpower losses, material losses, losses of equipment, losses of vehicles, it makes the prospect of like a finishing blow that much simpler and that much more potentially successful for Russia. So that's just to sort of reflect on what their psychology might be. I think it's something along those lines. But even the Russians, I don't think they have forever to wait either. I dare say that even the Russian people at some point will want this war to be drawn to a close. But I think the Russians have a lot more time up their sleeve than either Ukraine or the West.
I would agree with that. And I would say, really, the attrition strategy is, you do have to be careful with it because the bleeding white is, you don't want to end up in bleeding white your own forces. But what you're doing is you're waiting and you're consistently inflicting steady losses on your enemy, which are in many cases are irreplaceable losses. There's only so many BMPs that ex-Soviet bloc Eastern European NATO members can give you. So a lot of this equipment, even if it's substantial, you're not going to be able to get more of it over the long run. So what Russia's waiting for is for the right moment and the timing of a possible big aero offensive. I think you need to have all the logistics in place for it. You need to have the terrain primed for it. You need to have the disposition of your own forces ready for it. And all of that stuff needs to be pre-prepped. I think if you're possibly you'll see some forward motion in 2024. I don't know how much, and I'm not willing to say or to bet, but I think that in 2024, there's a comment in the chat actually I'll address about Odessa and wondering whether it'll be in play in 2024. I'm not sure. I think that if Western aid collapses, possibly. It's very far off. But that's dependent that you have to assume that Western aid is going to continue, right? The United States has, hundreds of thousands of Humvees that we can send. So Western aid is going to continue, I think.
Well, in terms of Ukrainian strategy, I suspect we might see, something like an attack on the Spit here, and maybe further landings in Kherson, because from the Ukrainian perspective, you know that the Russians won't be satisfied with ending the war until they connect with Transnistria over here through Odessa. So one of the things you could do is a delaying action and ensure that the Russians simply can't attack Odessa by attacking their Black Fleet assets and potentially preventing the Russians from doing any sort of major buildup in this area. As long as they can hold Kherson, which would be a very difficult nut for the Russians to crack at this point, and they can keep the Black Sea Fleet at bay. They sort of deny the Russians their maximalist ends of capturing Odessa. So, in terms of from the Ukrainian side, like what's the biggest problem you can cause for the Russians is basically make it impossible for them to take Odessa, if nothing else. So I suspect we won't see Odessa in play in 2024 because the Ukrainians are probably very aware of that, and there's no way they're going to allow the Russians to take Odessa while their army is still in good order.
Yeah, I think that the focus for the Russians is probably going to be in the Donetsk region.
Well, we can
those
basically
two
see it as
highways.
well. Yeah, that's what I was just going to comment on. If we're looking at the map from here and we look at where action is happening right now, it's clear there's two types of action. There's sort of recovery, or there's like defensive action, and here we have recovery from the Ukrainian offensive. They're trying to rebuild their defensive line around this canal here. They're trying to rebuild their defensive line on the Oskol River. But offensively, they are attempting. They're looking at capturing these two highway routes. They want to bust the Ukrainian defenses that have been built up for a long time, and then establish these two highway routes as a means of penetrating deep into Donetsk, probably in 2025. So I think the Russians in 2024 are going to tee up for the Big Arrow offensive in the Donetsk region in 2025, which will, of course, then set them up very well for continuing that into Zaporozhye and Dnipro. That's what I think their overall strategy is. I mean, obviously, I'm just guessing at that based on sort of what they appear to be doing on the map. But I don't think the Russians are going to go for Odessa yet, because that would be kind of a Hail Mary attack, and it's really the Ukrainians who need a Hail Mary at this point. Like how did the Ukrainians actually get out of this? They can hold out forever, well, not forever, but they can hold out for years and sort of hope that the Russians eventually get tired, or the West massively ramps up aid, which are both possible. But as we saw with the counteroffensive, they're currently unable to launch any decisive attack. So I think 2024 is probably going to be a year of serious defensive buildup. In fact, we actually know that the Ukrainians are building 3 major defensive lines in this region, actually, basically to stop a repeat of 2022 from happening. So it looks like the Ukrainians are now, in turn, like the Russians did in 2023, investing in defense in 2024 to try and make Russia's attrition strategy or counter it, basically by causing Russia's attrition to also be too high in order to actually sustain the conflict for several more years. So yeah, I think we're going to see heavy investment in Ukrainian defense 2024, and the Russians setting themselves up for big air offensives in 2025. No Odessa yet.
Yes, you've already seen investment on the Ukrainian side, especially in Chernihiv, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
They were, and this is stuff that I haven't seen before from the Ukrainians, which is concrete pillboxes with steel gun ports. Looks like rebar or basically reinforced trenches that aren't just like obviously hand dug or ersatz trenches that are constructed relatively quickly. These are prepared defensive emplacements that are intended to last a long time and well built too. So that's significant investment.
Yeah, and what that does, I mean, even if Russia secures most of the oblasts it has now annexed, it's going to signal to them that, well, you're either going to have to, it's basically negotiations, right? More or less. It's a way for the Ukrainians to negotiate an end to the war. As we've already seen, I should have brought up that article that was like, maybe Ukraine doesn't need all of its territory or something like that. But basically, if the Ukrainians can impose a severe enough cost on the Russians just in taking, these 4 oblasts, they can say, okay, look, you're going to have to pay that cost again 2 or 3 times over to take the other oblasts east of the Dnieper, like Kharkov in particular, but also Dnipro. Are you willing to pay that, or will you end the war as is? So I think Ukraine's out at this point is to ensure that Russia takes no more than the 4 oblasts. My opinion is that I mean, if I were on the Ukrainian negotiating side, I would basically have written off these 4 oblasts already. Not that they won't fight over them; they'll fight over them tooth and nail, and then basically once it's sort of time to give in, they'll say, okay, look, these 4 oblasts for an end to the war, or else you're going to have to go through that 10 times over. I think that's the way the Ukraine gets out of this in one piece, to the extent that it can get out of it. Well, it won't get out of it in one piece, to the extent they can get out of it in the least diminished state possible. It's to surrender no more than the 4 oblasts. The Russians, of course, I think by that point probably won't be willing to settle for the 4 oblasts. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, we do know as well that some Ukrainian delegation apparently more kind of semi-secretly flew to Washington D.C. a few weeks ago. You can sort of track aircraft. There are these autists who track the movements of aircraft, and you can basically guess that Ukraine, not Ukraine, the Russians sent a delegation to Washington D.C. potentially to negotiate. So negotiations are probably to some extent underway through back channels. I don't think an end will be negotiated in 2024, though.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the reason why I say that is, yes, people in the chat are discussing Odessa, and yes, Russia wants to deny Odessa to Ukraine. It also would, if it could, it would like to take all of everything east of the Dnieper. But yeah, Russia's minimum off ramp at this point is the 4 oblasts. And really, Ukraine could have easily said, okay, well, that's we can let that go. But now it's in Russia's ball court here. So it really depends on how Russia feels. If Russia is willing to continue the conflict, if they're willing to pay continued price for this, if there's no risk of Western escalation because the West has basically shot its wad in terms of military and financial, etc., aid to Ukraine, that might actually be in the Russian interest to continue. So even if Ukraine makes an overture for peace, Russia might say, no, you're out of men, you're out of resources. Every day that we continue fighting, there's less of your people and less of your tanks and less of your missiles and less of everything for you. So and more stuff for me. So that perception of increasing strength is not one which, or increasing relative strength, I should say, is one which is not going to make Russia less belligerent.
I mean, part of the problem, too, with negotiations is Russia's claimed the 4 oblasts, which actually includes territories west of the Dnieper, like Zaporozhye City and the rest of Kherson. And, could we imagine the Ukrainians giving up this territory in a treaty rather than making the Russians fight for it? It's hard for me to imagine Ukraine actually ceding the full oblast to the Russians. I mean, I guess there's the option of breaking them up, but of course, Russia has formally annexed this territory now, and I can't really see them backtracking on that either. So I think this sort of presents a big problem for both sides in terms of ending the war, because I cannot see any way for the Russians to actually cede what's west of the Dnieper here gracefully, nor do I see why the Ukrainians would just give up what is no doubt now a massively fortified position. So I think that's going to be a big blocker to negotiations ending, and I think that's why negotiations will not conclude until we actually see another big arrow offensive where the Russians do reestablish themselves on the west side of the Dnieper in some capacity. I think that's it for my closing thoughts. Marcus, do you have anything to add?
No, I really basically said what I had to say in that regard. I think you guys touched on some good points. Doubtless, I think given the wording come out of the Russians, from Putin, from people, from also from Lavrov and from others, Medvedev as well. I think the chances of well, you said the 4 oblasts, but I actually think you could nearly say 5 if you include Nikolaev. I don't think they'll leave Odessa isolated. I think there's definitely a strong probability that if Ukraine survives as a state, chances are it will not have access to the sea. And if the Russians do annex Odessa and Nikolaev and Kherson, then they would require those cities to actually have some kind of strategic depth. So you can imagine they will take some territory inland as well, probably including Kiviri as well, or Kivirog, as the Russians call it, which is just sort of north of Kherson. And really, I think the longer this drags on and the more reticent the Ukrainians are to sort of see facts as they are, I dare say the more things exist on the chopping block. I mean, if we think that the Russian-dominated areas are Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, a similar argument could be stated for Kharkov as well. And then, if the Russians sort of feel like their strategic interests or their strategic risks are being made more detrimental by Ukrainian holdings on the west side of the Dnieper River, then you could quite easily sort of see an argument being materialized for annexations regarding Sumy, for Chernigov, potentially Poltava. And you'll have a very, very small, if any, territory of Ukraine on the east side of the Dnieper River if the Russians are, if either their patience is sufficiently tried, or if there's sort of no backing down, if there's going to be the thing with the tit for tat war is, and funnily enough, again, this war is actually happening in Donbass in Russia. Again, we sort of saw this in World War II. You sort of have two sides that escalating in brutality and fierceness. And one side is not prepared to back down because it just is an escalation of ferocity. I mean, we're not at anywhere near that level of intensity or animosity or enmity, but a side that is on that. If one side of a conflict is appearing to be in ascendancy and is aiming towards victory, then the more that side is agitated and handled in not good faith, the less they're going to be interested in being, shall we say, amicable. They will drive the hardest bargain possible.
Yeah, another problem I noticed too for Moscow is that, well, part of the main reason this conflict even started is that NATO signaled intent for Ukraine to join the military alliance against Russia. Obviously, this part I have outlined here is the serious bit where it puts Moscow far too close to NATO borders, basically. So, I mean, the Russians kind of also need to take all this territory here because the whole point of the war basically is to not have NATO on Russia's doorstep. And if they conclude the war without taking this territory, I mean, inevitably it's going to end up NATO, and Russia at least has to secure itself to some extent against NATO. So, I mean, really, we're looking at far more than just the 4 oblasts. Like, it's hard for me to see Mr. Putin agreeing or even having the ability to agree to, with the support of the rest of the Russian state, any conclusion that doesn't secure Russia against this territory being in NATO. And I don't think simply agreeing that Ukraine won't be in NATO at this point is viable. I mean, I think whatever comes out of this, if there's a Ukrainian state left, it's going to join NATO. And then again, I mean, it almost looks like, Russia's more or less just going to have to conquer all of Ukraine, right? I mean, that kind of seems like where, yeah.
Well, I mean, that seems to be what the Western strategy is, and at least propagandistically. You need to have Putin be Herr Putler, and you have to have the narrative of, well, Putler is going to conquer all of Ukraine. It's not just his little territories that he wanted in Donetsk and Luhansk. He wants to conquer all of Europe, right? So that's the propaganda. The propaganda kayfabe that the West needs to roll with going forward. And so I think that to a certain degree, the West is incentivized to continue the conflict because otherwise Putin has to basically take all of Ukraine, and they're going to force him to do it.
I think they will. I mean, let's say, like, realistically, it looks like Russia might have to, quote unquote, take up to this line, right? Take Kiev, take everything east of the Dnieper, probably take. I mean, at this, if they're going to take Odessa, you don't want this huge salient sitting here, right? So probably establish, something like this border.
Yeah. Well,
But
that's the
problem
point I
is,
made about Kiev Rig or Kiev Rog as well, is that they will not want to leave that shoulder of the river vulnerable, because those three cities, Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, would be otherwise vulnerable to any kind of future NATO offensive if such a thing arose.
But of course, the problem, and I think that's fine, right? Like Jimmy Thomas has pointed out some of the defensive lines here. The Dnieper is the best one. I mean, I think in the result of a war, basically everything west of the Dnieper is more or less just buffer territory, so that the Russians have time to prepare a real defense to the east of the Dnieper. Is how a future conflict would play out. But I guess the problem is, okay, let's say Russia takes this. Well, so long as a Ukrainian state exists, even if it is just come on, Tool, even if the Ukrainian state is just this territory here, it's like, well, this territory can basically just do terrorist drone attacks against you literally forever. Like, it'll never stop, right? It's like Ukraine's already demonstrated that they're doing this. They've been doing this in Donetsk for 9 years now. So it's like, really, when you really think about what the West seems to desire here and what Russia needs, it's hard to imagine any way this ends without Russia simply conquering the entire country, to be honest.
I dare say, though, Russia probably wants to avoid inheriting a problem as well. And I think the problem with conquering all of Ukraine is that, firstly, I dare say,
subduing it and putting a rump Ukrainian state in alliance with Russia like Belarus is.
Well, the point I was going to make was this: is that that brings about its own problems too. And then, secondly, even amongst Russia's strategic partners and allies, even though the Russians are probably less flaky in this respect compared to, say, what the West is. I mean, in the end, still there is, and I hate to use the analogy because I know all three of us and many of our viewers know that it's nonsense, but the so-called, sort of rule-based order, the laws-based order, there are things that even Russian partners and allies don't want to see, and the elimination of a country from a map is probably one of them. But if you zoom in, Charlie, can I just give my my take on what the borders will probably look like? Just go like another zoom level. Okay, so if you draw, oh yeah, that's it. Good. That's about perfect. Oh no, just one more level in, just so we can sort of see slightly smaller prospects. No, oh good, that's good. So if you go to just scroll that map directly south, see, just up a little bit. Yeah, so if you see where Balta is, which is right on the border with Transnistria, if you sort of draw a line from Balta to possibly Kremenchuk, which is right where the Dnieper widens, top right, Kremenchuk. Yeah. So if you draw a line between those two, roughly that is where I imagine a frontier will be, because then you've got Odessa, Mykolaiv, and Kherson, which are on the essentially on the sea, and then Kiev Rig or Kiev Rog, as the Russians call it, is about sort of halfway in between. And this is sort of like a frontier whereby they would have to, in the event of a Ukrainian state existing, that is a relatively long frontier for them to have to man, never mind actually having for them to man the river with defenses and with soldiers. And then the Russians can have a whole bunch of assets on the other side of the river that will be well protected. They could be sort of anti-air assets, anti-missile assets, radar, etc. That would be almost impossible for the Ukrainians to get access to. And then basically in a Ukrainian state would be like a wedge shape, which would make them vulnerable to any kind of like essentially either big arrow attacks or just generalized attrition warfare. Because in the end, Ukraine, pared down from what it already is, would have a lot less manpower to draw upon. So therefore, such an arrangement, if that was going to be a rump state, that's what I imagine it would sort of look like. Yeah, exactly. You've kind of got it more or less down pat there. It'll include those couple of other oblasts on the other side of the river, and then I think there's there's two oblasts that are just west of the river. You can just see. Oh, go back in again, Charlie. Where Shokatsky is across, and sort of like there's two oblasts that just over the river. That's probably the only thing that Ukraine will have if they have any east of the Dnieper at all. The rest will be Russian, I would say, because they'll probably take Poltava. Exactly. So Poltava, Kharkov, Chernigov, Sumy.
I guess the question is whether or not they'd be satisfied with Kiev remaining the capital of Ukraine or not.
Exactly, that will be the one determining factor. Will Kiev remain the center of government for a Ukrainian state, or will it become Lvov, or will it become Zhytomyr or some other city in the west?
Yeah, I guess the problem too is if they don't extend that far, I mean, you've still only added 200 kilometers to the 400-kilometer distance to Moscow, so it kind of seems like, I mean, the Russians have to go up to the Dnieper River, so what the hell? What is that? Maybe
there's your NATO bomber with your hypersonic missile.
Well, it is a live update map. I don't know. That's funny. I think I triggered that somehow. But in any case, I think they would have to split these oblasts in two, which maybe they could negotiate and have Russia take east. What the hell is that? Anyway,
that's hilarious. But yes, I think if there's a Ukrainian rum state, it would probably look something like that. But I dare say the Russians would be loath to leave anything too far south vulnerable, because in the end they don't want places like Odessa and Mykolaiv being vulnerable to strategic weapons, right? Or even to be overly exposed to drones and UAVs. And then the Russians will want to be as close to the Dnieper on the east side, if not the East Bank itself. That's just my take.
Yeah, I mean, the problem, too, though, is okay, so we're talking about Russia having to conquer all of Ukraine here, but that would impose an insanely high cost on Russia. Let's be honest. It's hard to imagine that even being within their capability. So we're probably looking at another, Afghanistan tier war in terms of the disaster it's going to be for the overall society if things actually go to that level. I'm not saying the Russian state's going to collapse. It's just going to really bring Russia's worst fears true, which is that they play second fiddle to China, which I think is the big idea here, is just impose such a cost on Russia that they can't enter the sort of world leadership position they're aiming for.
Yeah, but that being said, there is an old quote. I think I can't remember who said it. I think it might have been Machiavelli, because the original quote was by Cicero, where he said the sinews of war is infinite money. But then Machiavelli sort of paraphrased him by saying that the sinews of war is good soldiers. And I think yes, on paper, perhaps to a point, economically, industrially, yes, China has some benefits going for it. But in the end, what we've actually seen is strangely enough, is a revitalization of the Russian economy. The Russian economy has actually kind of gone through something not too when I say not too dissimilar, it's obviously not the same, and there are vast differences, but not too dissimilar to the recovery of the German economy, sort of in the build up towards World War II, where through essentially autarkic policies and driven by necessity, the Russian industry has actually responded in a very positive way, and they've actually managed to fill a number of their own gaps and increase efficiencies in areas where they were previously lacking. And then on the other hand, they're going to have essentially the only standing military in the world that actually has conventional modern experience in warfare, and a tremendous number of NCOs and officer level men, and even privates who have combat experience in these settings that no other army can boast of. And it's not just Middle Eastern anti-insurgency tactics. This is actual warfare in the true sense of the word. So I don't think everything's negative from the Russian standpoint. The only sort of tragedy here is that Ukraine will be absolutely eviscerated as a state. And they've been eviscerated on the behest of NATO.
I think I accidentally just bombed the remains of the Mosque over there. Can I just oh my god, Ukraine shells are just the best. I just have this little plane just bomb Russians. It's amazing. Yeah, actually, you can replace the NATO symbols on this map with literal pigs. Yeah, I mean it's a Ukraine map, right? Let's go bomb the piggies. Yay. Okay. All right, that's enough of that. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you,
Mandrill. Indeed.
I have Find My Friends in the description, so if people want to click on that, they can go find your stuff. And yeah, unless you guys want to add anything else, happy New Year to everybody, and I'll see you next year.
Indeed. Thank you for
Thanks
having
again.
us on, Charlie. It's been an interesting year, and it's wonderful whether we're joined by Prude or Mandrill or whoever it is that tends to come on these. It's always good fun. So we'll catch you guys in the new year, and indeed to our viewers and fans. Good luck, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful, or at least a good 2023, and all the best for the coming year. Many blessings. Thank you.
Bye bye.